Section 1. The town that shouldn't exist. There is a town in America that does not appear on any official map. It sits somewhere between the mountains and the ocean, between the desert and the farmland, between the Rust Belt and the Sun Belt, in a geography that no actual state could contain. It has a nuclear power plant, a tire fire that has been burning for decades, a harbor, a gorge, a monorail that was built and forgotten, an elementary school, a prison, a hospital, and a quick-stop convenience store that seems to exist at the center of the universe. It has been invaded. It has been sealed under a dome by the federal government. It has been destroyed and rebuilt so many times that the rebuilding itself has become unremarkable. Its residents have 4 fingers on each hand. Their skin is the color of warm butter. Their eyes are larger than human eyes should be. Their fish have 3 eyes. Their hair defies gravity without product. And nobody, not one single person who lives there, has ever looked around and asked the obvious question, what is happening to us? The town is Springfield. And it is the subject of the longest-running scripted primetime television show in American history. 36 seasons, nearly 800 episodes, decades of Sunday nights, generations of viewers. A cultural footprint so enormous that it has become impossible to measure. And yet, buried under all of that history, woven into the fabric of every joke and every callback and every throwaway gag across all those years of television, there are secrets. Real ones. The kind that have been hiding in plain sight for so long that they've become invisible, the way a smell in your own house eventually disappears even though it never left. This is not a breakdown of trivia. This is not a list of Easter eggs. What we're going to do tonight, slowly and carefully, is pull back the curtain on the version of Springfield that the show has been building beneath the surface of the one you think you know. The darker version, the stranger version, the one where every mystery connects to every other mystery, where every unexplained thing points back to the same root cause, and where the town's famous inability to change or grow or age is not a cartoon convention but a symptom of something much more unsettling. Get comfortable. This is going to take a while. And the more settled you are, the more clearly you'll be able to see what Springfield has actually been showing you all along. Before we go anywhere, it helps to understand what made Springfield unusual from the very beginning. Not the yellow skin or the 4 fingers, those were always stylistic choices, and we'll get to what they might actually mean later. What made Springfield unusual was the specificity of its ordinariness. Matt Groening, the show's creator, named the town after the most common city name in America. There are Springfields in 34 states. The choice was deliberate. It was meant to signal that this was not a place. It was every place. The nuclear plant, the lazy safety inspector, the corrupt billionaire, the overworked wife, the underperforming school, the crumbling infrastructure and the government that looked the other way, these were not invented for comedy. They were observed from the American landscape of the late 1980s and concentrated into a single fictional address. That's what Springfield was at its origin, a mirror, a satirical compression of the America that already existed. And for the first few seasons, it functioned exactly that way. The storylines were grounded, the problems were recognizable. Homer struggled with money, Marge struggled with her sense of self, Bart struggled with authority and the creeping awareness that the world expected more from him than he was willing to give. Lisa struggled with the loneliness that tends to follow intelligence in communities that don't reward it. These were real stories. Told through cartoon characters, yes, but rooted in the texture of actual life. The financial anxiety was real. The marital tension was real. The feeling of being trapped in a job that diminished you, in a town that offered no exit, that was real too. And then something changed. It didn't change all at once. It shifted gradually, the way a river changes course over decades, moving so slowly that nobody standing on the bank notices until they look down one day and realize the water is running somewhere completely different. The show got stranger. The plots escalated. The world of Springfield expanded outward into territory that had nothing to do with the domestic struggles that originally defined it. And the mysteries began to accumulate. Some of those mysteries were introduced and abandoned. A 3-eyed fish was pulled from a river near the power plant and became national news within the show, and then vanished from the conversation entirely. Human skeletons were discovered in the basement of the nuclear facility, and nobody asked who they were or how they got there. A baby shot a billionaire, and the case was closed with a shrug. The show's own principal was revealed to be an imposter who had been living under a stolen identity for 20 years, and the town voted unanimously to keep the lie and exile the truth. These are not things that happen in the background of a lighthearted animated comedy. These are things that happen in a town with something deeply wrong at its foundation. So let's start there, not with the secrets themselves, but with the framework. Because the most important thing to understand about Springfield is that it was never designed to be understood. It was designed to be experienced, to feel familiar and strange at the same time. To make you laugh at things that, if you thought about them for too long, would stop being funny and start being something else entirely. The genius of the show, and this is not a small thing, is that it has always trusted its audience to look the other way. It introduces a mystery, lets it breathe for an episode or two, and then moves on, trusting that the pace of the storytelling will carry you past the moment before you have time to ask, "Wait, did they ever explain that?" Most of the time, they didn't. And the things they didn't explain tend to be the most interesting things the show ever put on screen. Tonight, we're going back for all of them. We're going back to the power plant and the leaking reactor cores and the three-eyed fish, and the question of what decades of radiation exposure does to a population that has never been told it's happening. We're going back to the hospital bed where Homer Simpson may or may not have woken up from a coma in April of 1993, and examining what it would mean for every episode since if he didn't. We're reopening the Burns shooting, looking at the evidence again without the show's preferred conclusion already in mind, and seeing where it actually points. We're tracing the lifespan of Charles Montgomery Burns and trying to understand how a man born in the late 1800s is still running a nuclear power plant, still manipulating municipal politics, and still glowing in the dark after his weekly medical treatments. We're going to spend time with Maggie Simpson, who has been 1 year old for 36 years and who has, in that time, shot a man, led a rebellion, demonstrated cognitive abilities that no infant should possess, and chosen with apparent deliberateness to keep all of it hidden behind a pacifier and a blank expression. We're going to follow the trail left by Mona Simpson, Homer's mother, who didn't die when Homer was a child. She was driven underground by the same billionaire who would later employ her son, and the conspiracy that connects those two facts is one of the darkest threads the show has ever pulled. We're going to examine the episode that the show's own fan base has called the worst in its history and argue that it is actually the most important because it is the only episode that shows you, in real time, how Springfield maintains its impossible reality. And we're going to talk about why Springfield has no fixed location, not as a trivia question, but as a theory. Because a town with no address has no regulatory authority. A town that can't be found on a map can't be held accountable for what happens inside it. And Springfield has a great deal to answer for, if anyone ever figures out where to send the summons. All of this is going to take time, and that's fine. There's nowhere to be right now. The world outside is doing whatever it's doing, and you're here, and Springfield is waiting, and we have as long as we need. One more thing before we begin in earnest. The theories we're going to discuss tonight are not all equal in their certainty. Some of them are supported by so much canonical evidence that they feel less like theories and more like conclusions the show arrived at and then decided not to announce. Some of them are more speculative, more poetic, built on patterns and emotional logic rather than explicit confirmation. And some of them exist in the space between, where the evidence is strong enough to take seriously but not quite conclusive enough to declare settled. What they all share is this: they take the show seriously. They treat Springfield not as a backdrop for jokes, but as a place with its own internal logic, its own history, its own wounds. And when you do that, when you apply the same attention to Springfield that you'd apply to any place you actually care about, the town reveals itself to be far more carefully constructed than its surface suggests. It was built to look like chaos. It runs on a kind of terrible order. Let's find it. Springfield was introduced to America on the 17th of December, 1989. The episode was called Simpsons Roasting on an Open Fire. It was a Christmas special, and it was not originally intended to be a series premiere. It was intended to be a test, an experiment in whether the characters from a short segment on a variety show could sustain a full half-hour story on their own. The answer, it turned out, was yes. And more than yes, the answer was that these characters could sustain 36 years of stories without any of them aging a single day. That last detail is the one that should be most disturbing, And it's also the one that most people have made peace with so thoroughly that it no longer registers as strange at all. Bart Simpson was 10 years old when the show began. He is 10 years old right now. Lisa was 8. She is 8 now. Maggie was 1. She has been 1 for longer than most of the show's current audience has been alive. Homer and Marge were in their mid-30s. They still are, despite the fact that the children who watched them in 1989 are now in their 50s. Time passes in the real world. Time does not pass in Springfield. This is, in the language of television production, called a floating timeline. It means the show's present is always the viewer's present. The year changes, the technology changes, the cultural references shift with the times, but the characters remain locked at the same age forever. It's a common device. The Flintstones did it. The Jetsons did it. Most long-running animated shows do it, because the alternative aging the characters in real time would require eventually writing storylines about children leaving home, parents growing old, and the end of the family dynamic that makes the show what it is. Nobody wants to watch that. So the characters stay the same age, and the audience learns to accept it as a feature rather than a flaw. What makes The Simpsons different is the duration. When a show runs for 2 seasons with a floating timeline, the effect is nearly invisible. When it runs for 36 seasons, the contradictions begin to stack. Homer's backstory, originally anchored to the late 1970s, has been quietly rewritten multiple times to keep pace with a present that keeps moving forward. His high school years, once defined by Watergate and disco, are now apparently set somewhere in the early 2000s. Marge's hair, her prom dress, the music they fell in love to, all of it has been revised and revised again, draft after draft of the same origin story, each version placing their youth in a different decade while somehow always arriving at the same marriage, the same house, the same family. This is not continuity in any conventional sense. This is something closer to mythology. Stories that exist in a kind of eternal present, where the details can shift between tellings because the truth the story is trying to convey is emotional rather than factual. Homer and Marge love each other. They always have. The decade in which that love began is, in some sense, beside the point. But here's where it gets interesting. The floating timeline creates contradictions, yes, but it also creates a very specific atmosphere. Springfield feels suspended, held in place, like a snow globe that someone shook decades ago and the flakes are still falling in slow motion, never quite settling, the storm inside never quite ending. Seasons change in Springfield, but the seasons loop. Years pass, but nobody ages. Catastrophes happen, but by the following week, the catastrophe has been forgotten, and the town has returned to a version of itself that predates the disaster. The show resets. It always resets. And the reset happens so reliably, with such mechanical consistency, that it starts to feel less like a production convenience and more like a feature of Springfield itself. Like the town is actively resisting change. Like something in the fabric of the place is holding the clock still. Why would a town do that? We have several answers, and we're going to spend the rest of tonight working through all of them. But before we get to the theories, there's one more thing to establish about what Springfield is at baseline. One more quality that distinguishes it from the generic American small town it was originally designed to represent. Springfield is a company town. It has businesses, sure. It has a donut shop, and a bowling alley, and a bar called Moe's, and a Quickie Mart on every corner. But the economic foundation of Springfield, the thing that keeps the lights on and the paychecks coming and the whole social structure standing, is the Springfield nuclear power plant. And the plant is owned, operated, and controlled by one man, Charles Montgomery Burns. Burns is not a background character. He is not a recurring villain in the traditional sense. He is the architecture of Springfield's economy. His plant provides the electricity. His employment practices shape the workforce. His political connections determine what the town government does and doesn't investigate. His wealth is so disproportionate to everything around it that it functions less like wealth and more like a natural force, something that exists, like gravity, shaping everything in its vicinity without anyone having to consciously think about it. Springfield is his. Not in the sense that he owns the land or holds the deeds, in the sense that he owns the infrastructure of survival. You can leave Springfield, theoretically, but where would you go? And would you have a job when you got there? And who would write you a reference? The company-town dynamic is not subtle in The Simpsons. The show flags it regularly and clearly. What's subtle is the way it connects to everything else. The way it creates a web of dependency so total that the population of Springfield has, over the course of decades, become unable to challenge the system that oppresses them, not because they lack the will, but because the system has quietly made sure they lack the cognitive tools. That's the real secret of Springfield. Not any one mystery. Not the shooting or the coma or the undying billionaire. It's the system. The way every piece of it fits together to produce a population that is, by any reasonable measure, incapable of perceiving its own exploitation. We're going to trace every thread of that system tonight. And we're going to start at the very beginning, with the plant, with the leaking reactor, with the three-eyed fish and the glowing rats and the radioactive waste that gets dumped into rivers and onto playgrounds and used as a paperweight on somebody's desk. We're going to start with the contamination. Because if you want to understand Springfield, you have to start with what the power plant has been doing to it. Quietly, steadily, for decades. Building something in the water and the air and the soil. Something that changed the people who live there in ways that made them easier to control, easier to ignore, and easier to keep exactly where they are. The town that shouldn't exist was built to last. And the reason it has lasted this long is the same reason the fish have 3 eyes and the safety inspector has an IQ of 55 and the billionaire has been alive for over a century. It was engineered that way. But we'll get to the engineering. First, let's get quiet. Let's settle into this. Because the story of Springfield is a long one, and the best way to hear it is slowly, the way you'd read a letter from someone you love, not rushing toward the end, but staying with each word as it comes. Springfield is waiting. It's always waiting. The lights are on in every window on Evergreen Terrace. The TV is on in the living room. The couch is right there. Come in. Sit down. We have a long night ahead of us, and every secret is worth finding. End of section 1. After this section, viewer prompt. Drop a comment with the time and where you're watching from. It's always something to see how many people find their way to Springfield at 2 in the morning from places all over the world. And if this is the kind of content that makes your nights a little quieter, subscribing keeps more of it coming your way. Section 2. The Nuclear Conspiracy. What the plant has been doing to Springfield. Let's talk about what the Springfield nuclear power plant actually is. Not what it looks like on the surface, the familiar silhouette of those cooling towers, the steam rising against whatever sky the animators chose that day, the way it sits on the horizon of nearly every establishing shot like a piece of furniture, nobody thinks to question anymore. Not the aesthetics of it, the reality of it. The Springfield nuclear power plant is a 2-unit pressurized water reactor facility. It provides the primary source of electrical power for the entire town. It is owned by Charles Montgomery Burns, a man whose personal fortune is so vast that it stopped being meaningful as a number sometime in the early 20th century. And it is, by any standard of measurement you care to apply, one of the most dangerous industrial facilities in the history of fiction. A surprise safety inspection surprise, meaning the facility had no time to prepare, no time to hide what it was actually doing, found 342 separate violations. 342. The estimated cost to bring the plant into compliance with basic safety standards was $56 million. Burns refused to spend it, not because he lacked the funds. Burns could have written that check without noticing the withdrawal. He refused because fixing the problems would require admitting they existed, and admitting they existed would invite questions about what those problems had already done to the people of Springfield over the preceding decades. So the violations remained, and they were not minor. We're talking about radioactive waste being dumped directly into bodies of water that Springfield residents drink from and fish in. We're talking about radioactive waste being left in playgrounds where children play, plutonium used as a desk decoration, cooling towers with cracks in the walls, the cracks patched with wads of chewing gum, glowing rats moving through the walls and basement corridors of an active nuclear facility, and then, in the show's most casually delivered horror, human skeletons in the basement, not one, multiple. Human remains in the basement of a working nuclear power plant, and the show mentions this detail once, lets it hang in the air for a moment, and then moves on. Nobody asks who those people were. Nobody investigates how they got there. The skeletons are just part of the inventory, filed alongside the cracked cooling towers and the luminous rodents, unremarkable, in a place where nothing is remarkable anymore because everything has stopped being remarkable a long time ago. The safety inspector responsible for preventing all of this, the man whose actual job description is to stand between the plant's operations and catastrophic harm to the surrounding population, is Homer Simpson. Homer Simpson, who the show's own creator has stated has an IQ of 55. Homer Simpson, who in one episode is revealed to have had a crayon lodged in his brain since childhood, physically occupying the region responsible for higher cognitive function. Homer Simpson, who falls asleep at his workstation, who has eaten donuts during meltdown warnings, who once caused a nuclear incident by throwing a baked good into a reactor core to see what would happen. This is the man standing between Springfield and radioactive catastrophe. He has been standing there, failing continuously and without consequence, for over 3 decades. Now, here's where the theory moves from dark comedy into something more serious. The show tells us, directly and clearly, that the plant is contaminating the environment. It doesn't whisper this. It states it plainly, multiple times, through multiple storylines, and then trusts that the volume of the jokes surrounding the revelation will carry most viewers past the moment before they stop to think about what they just heard. The first visible mutation appeared in Season 2, Blinky, the three-eyed fish. Blinky was pulled from a river near the plant and immediately became a story of national interest within the show's universe. A gubernatorial candidate used Blinky as evidence that Burns was poisoning Springfield's waterways. The pressure was enough that Burns was forced, on live television, to eat the fish himself, a demonstration of its apparent harmlessness. The town watched, they were satisfied, the story disappeared. Nobody conducted a follow-up water study. Nobody tested the fish population further. Nobody asked the question that a child with basic reasoning skills would have thought to ask within about 30 seconds of hearing the story. If the fish in the river near the nuclear plant have developed a third eye from the radiation in the water, what is the radiation doing to the people who drink the same water? That question hangs over Springfield like the steam from the cooling towers. Unanswered. Unasked. Deliberately avoided by a population that has, for reasons we will come back to, lost the cognitive capacity to follow that particular thread to its logical conclusion. The answer to the question comes in Season 8. It comes indirectly, in an episode that appears on the surface to be a playful X-Files parody, but which contains, in its resolution, one of the most genuinely disturbing pieces of information the show has ever delivered. The episode is called The Springfield Files. Homer sees something in the woods near the plant, a figure, glowing, moving strangely. He's terrified. The town becomes convinced it's an extraterrestrial. FBI agents arrive. The mystery builds. And when the reveal finally comes, the creature from the woods is not an alien. It's Mr. Burns. Burns, it turns out, undergoes a weekly medical treatment so intensive, so loaded with experimental chemicals and radiation therapy, that it causes his body to emit a visible green glow. The treatment is not optional. Without it, Burns dies. He needs it administered on a precise weekly schedule, and each session leaves him in a dazed, euphoric, barely conscious state that has him wandering through the forest surrounding the plant, like something from a fever dream, stumbling, glowing, barely human in his movements. The people of Springfield saw a glowing humanoid figure emerging from the woods near the nuclear plant, and their collective interpretation was space alien. Not radiation exposure. Not a medical anomaly connected to the most dangerous facility within 50 miles. Space alien. That's the depth of the denial in Springfield. Or, as we'll consider in a moment, that's the depth of the damage. Sit with the Burns detail for a moment, because it matters more than it initially appears to. Burns owns the plant. Burns understands radiation better than anyone in Springfield because he is personally dependent on managing its effects in his own body. His medical team has developed treatments sophisticated enough to keep a man alive for well over a century through what amounts to chronic radiation poisoning. They understand, with clinical precision, exactly what prolonged radiation exposure does to biological systems. They have been managing those effects in Burns himself for decades, which means Burns knows what his plant is doing to Springfield. He knows because his body is experiencing a concentrated version of the same process. He knows because he has the resources to study it, to model it, to track what happens to biological organisms over time when they're exposed to the kind of radiation his facility has been leaking since the day it opened. And he knows because the results, when you look at Springfield's population, with that knowledge in mind, are exactly what the science would predict. Start with the residents themselves. Homer Simpson, massive overbite, eyes that bulge beyond any reasonable human proportion, 4 fingers on each hand, a skull shape that defies normal human biology, an IQ so low it qualifies as a clinical disability. A body that has survived falls, electrocutions, car collisions, explosions, and injuries that, in any real human being, would have been fatal multiple times over. His healing rate is not human. His pain tolerance is not human. He has worked in direct proximity to an active reactor core for his entire adult life. Marge Simpson, the same enlarged eyes, the same 4-fingered hands, hair that grows in a perfect vertical tower, and has maintained that shape for 36 years without the assistance of any visible product. She was briefly employed at the plant herself, exposed directly to the facility's interior environment. Their 3 children were all born in Springfield, all raised within daily exposure distance of the plant's emissions. All 3 display the same physical characteristics: the yellow skin, the overbites, the structural features that deviate from normal human anatomy in ways that are consistent across the entire Springfield population but appear in no one who comes from outside the town. That last detail is the one that makes the theory click. When guest characters arrive in Springfield, when celebrities visit, when characters from outside the town appear, the show draws them differently. More naturalistic proportions, eyes closer to human scale, features that more closely resemble actual human anatomy. The difference is visible and consistent. Outsiders look like people. Springfield residents look like Springfield residents. The standard explanation is that this is just the show's art style. The main characters have a specific design language, and realistic-looking guests are a visual shorthand for their outsider status. This is true, as far as it goes. The show's creators have confirmed as much. But within the internal logic of the show's universe accepting Springfield as a real place rather than a drawn one, the art style difference maps onto something specific. People who grew up in Springfield look different from people who didn't. The town's longtime residents share a set of physical characteristics that appear nowhere else. And those characteristics are consistent with what you would expect from multi-generational exposure to chronic low-level radiation. Mutation. Not the dramatic movie kind, where someone gains superpowers in a costume. The quiet, incremental biological kind, where the effects compound across generations, and by the time the changes are visible, they've been happening so long that everyone has forgotten what normal looked like. Even the animals show it. Santa's little helper, the Simpson family dog, has the same enlarged eyes as his owners, the same proportional deviations from normal canine anatomy. The wildlife of Springfield is mutated by the plant's runoff, and the show tells you this directly with Blinky. The show then expects you to believe, on some level, that the radiation affecting the fish has had no comparable effect on the humans. It hasn't been more subtle with the humans. It's been exactly as obvious. The show just trusted you to accept it as aesthetic rather than evidence. Now consider what this means at the level of population-wide effect. Chronic radiation exposure, particularly the neurological kind, doesn't just produce physical mutations. It affects cognitive function. It produces damage to the parts of the brain responsible for critical thinking, for pattern recognition, for the kind of sustained causal reasoning that allows a person to look at a situation and trace it back to its cause. The symptoms of neurological radiation damage include memory problems, difficulty with complex reasoning, reduced ability to perceive long-term consequences, and a kind of cognitive fog that makes people easier to manipulate and harder to organize. Look at Springfield's population. They cannot maintain complex thought across episodes. They cannot connect events separated by any significant span of time. They have watched their town get destroyed and rebuilt so many times that the rebuilding has become routine. They watched a 3-eyed fish get caught near the nuclear plant and forgot about it within an episode. They were sealed under a dome by the federal government and, by the next relevant storyline, appeared to have no memory of this having happened. They consistently fail to connect obviously connected things. They consistently fail to ask the most basic follow-up questions about the most alarming events in their lives. This is what chronic neurological damage looks like at the community level. It's not stupidity in the traditional sense. It's impairment. A specific, targeted kind of impairment that happens to serve the interests of the man who owns the facility that caused it. A population that can't think clearly is a population that can't organize. A population that can't maintain memories across time is a population that can't build a case. A population whose critical thinking has been quietly eroded is a population that will keep showing up to work at the plant, keep voting for Burns's preferred candidates, keep accepting the explanations offered by the authority structures Burns controls. The conspiracy, if you want to call it that, doesn't require secret meetings or explicit coordination. It requires only that the contamination continue, that the medical establishment look the other way, and that the one man who understands what the radiation is doing to the population has enough resources to make sure nobody ever asks him to explain it. Burns has all three of those things. He has always had all three. The German investors are worth a moment of attention here. In one episode, Burns's plant is purchased by a group of German businessmen. The very first thing they do after taking ownership is fire Homer. The second thing they do is bring in engineers to assess the cost of bringing the plant up to code. When they receive the estimate, they nearly go bankrupt from the number alone. They sell the plant back to Burns at a loss, unable to afford the liability they've inherited. Burns buys it back and rehires Homer immediately. A competent safety inspector is the single biggest threat to Burns's operation. A competent safety inspector, doing their job as described, would document the violations, file the reports, and trigger a regulatory process that would either shut the plant down or force the kind of investment that would make the whole enterprise unprofitable. Homer is many things, but he is not a regulatory threat. He is the opposite of a regulatory threat. He is a regulatory black hole, absorbing the responsibility for plant safety and converting it into a gentle comedic backdrop for the town's existence. This is not accident. This is selection. Homer's continued employment is a strategic choice by a man who understands exactly what kind of oversight he needs to avoid. He doesn't need no safety inspector that would raise questions. He needs the right kind of safety inspector. The kind who will miss everything, every time, with complete sincerity, and who will never be able to explain why, and who will never be replaced, because the arrangement is protected by a separate conspiracy involving Homer's father that we'll come back to in detail later. Homer is not the victim of Burns's negligence. Homer is a component of Burns's system. His incapacity is the mechanism by which the system continues to function. Let's go deeper into what the radiation theory actually predicts, because the theory is more specific than just the plant is bad and everyone is mutated. If you accept the premise that decades of radiation exposure have altered the biology and neurology of Springfield's population in ways consistent with what the science suggests chronic, low-level exposure would do, then a remarkable number of the show's ongoing mysteries resolve themselves without any additional explanation needed. The characters don't age. The radiation theory's answer to this is biological. Cellular mutation at the level the theory proposes doesn't just change the body, it changes the mechanisms by which the body changes. If the basic processes of cellular renewal and differentiation have been disrupted by decades of radiation, the normal progression of aging may simply not operate the same way. The characters are frozen not because of narrative convenience, but because their biology has been altered at a level so fundamental that the clock itself has been disrupted. The town resets after catastrophic events. If the population's memory function has been compromised by chronic neurological damage, if the ability to consolidate and retain complex memories over time is impaired at the community level, then the town's famous amnesia is not a writing shortcut. It's a symptom. The people of Springfield literally cannot hold on to the memory of the dome, or the disaster, or the shooting with the same fidelity that an undamaged population would. The reset is neurological. Homer survives things that should kill him. The radiation theory has a specific answer for this too. It's not the same answer as cartoon invincibility. The theory proposes that Homer's body has adapted to radiation exposure over decades in ways that have made him functionally more resilient to physical trauma. The same cellular mutations that altered his cognitive function may have produced unexpected changes in his capacity to heal, to absorb damage, to reconstitute after injury. He's not surviving because the show needs him to survive. He's surviving because something in his biology has been profoundly changed. Burns stays alive through treatments. This is the radiation theory's most elegant resolution. Burns is not immortal in any mystical sense. He is the beneficiary of the same science that has been altering the population of Springfield for decades, applied with precision and resources that nobody else in town has access to. He has been managing his own radiation exposure as a medical protocol for over a century, with a team of personal physicians who have developed treatments sophisticated enough to maintain the disease equilibrium that keeps him functional. He's not cheating death. He's engineering his survival with the same meticulous attention he applies to everything else. And then there is the crayon. Season 12 of The Simpsons reveals that Homer once had the crayon removed from his brain, the foreign object that had been physically occupying the region responsible for higher-order cognition since Homer was a child. When the crayon comes out, Homer's IQ rockets upward. He becomes, for a short time, what the show describes as genuinely intelligent, articulate, capable of sustained complex thought, aware, and miserable. With the crayon removed, Homer sees Springfield clearly for the first time. He sees his job for what it is. He sees the gap between the life he's living and the life he might have lived. He sees the architecture of his own situation, the plant, the boss, the town, the system, with the kind of clarity that his impaired cognition had always protected him from. And it's unbearable. So he has the crayon put back in. He chooses the fog. He chooses the diminished version of himself over the version that can see. This is one of the most quietly devastating things the show has ever done. Homer's stupidity is not natural, it's mechanical. There is a physical object in his skull that is suppressing his cognitive function, and the show reveals this, and then, in the same storyline, shows Homer choosing to restore that suppression because seeing clearly is worse than not seeing at all. But the radiation theory adds a layer to this that the episode itself doesn't address. How did a crayon get lodged in Homer's brain without anyone noticing? He went through childhood, adolescence, and decades of adult life in Springfield. He visited doctors, he got checkups. Not one medical professional in the entire span of his life found a foreign object in his skull. Two possibilities. Either every doctor in Springfield is so impaired by the same contamination affecting their patients that they can't do basic diagnostic work effectively, or someone knew the crayon was there and chose not to remove it. And if the medical establishment of Springfield is compromised, if Burns's influence extends into the healthcare infrastructure of a town he essentially owns, then Homer's crayon stops being an accident and becomes something much more specific. A tool, placed, or at minimum preserved, to ensure that the safety inspector of the most dangerous facility in Springfield remains exactly as cognitively limited as he needs to be. This is where the radiation theory becomes not just a theory about accidental contamination, but a theory about deliberate exploitation. Burns didn't necessarily poison Springfield on purpose at the start, but at some point, and the evidence suggests this point came early, he understood what the contamination was doing and chose to let it continue, chose to leverage it, chose to build a system on top of it that converted the population's impairment into a structural advantage for himself. A town that can't think clearly is a town that will never challenge its employer. A town that can't hold memories is a town that will never build a case. A town whose medical establishment is compromised will never tell people what's being done to them. And a town that never learns what's being done to it will keep drinking the water and breathing the air and sending its children to the school funded by the plant and voting for the candidates Burns prefers, generation after generation, in an endless cycle of damage and complicity that looks, from the outside, like just how things are in a quiet American town. The Springfield nuclear power plant isn't just part of the show. It isn't just a backdrop for Homer's job or a symbol of American industrial irresponsibility. Within the framework of what the show has actually put on screen across 36 seasons, it is the mechanism by which Springfield's entire reality has been shaped. The yellow skin, the four fingers, the overbites, the three-eyed fish, the man who glows in the dark after his weekly treatments, the safety inspector with a crayon in his brain, the town that always forgets. The family that never ages. Every one of these things connects back to those cracked cooling towers, leaking their invisible payload into the water and the air and the soil of a community that was never supposed to figure out what was happening to it. And thanks to the contamination, they never have. Springfield isn't a quirky cartoon town, it's a contamination zone, and its residents aren't eccentric, they're symptomatic. That distinction matters. It changes the emotional register of everything that happens there. It changes the nature of the comedy. Because it's not funny if the punchline is that these people are damaged, and the damage is being deliberately maintained, unless of course you accept that the show has always known that. That the comedy was always a wrapper around something darker. That Springfield was never really a place to laugh at, it was always a place to recognize, to see your own town in. To see the nuclear plant on your horizon, and the billionaire in his mansion, and the inspector asleep at his workstation and think, wait, is that us? Maybe it always was. Maybe that was the whole point. Let the thought settle. Let it sink. We're just getting started, and the night is long, and the next secret is a big one. End of Section 2. Section 3. Homer's Coma, the dream that never ended. Now we need to consider the possibility that everything we just discussed, the radiation, the mutations, the glowing billionaire, the three-eyed fish, the entire impossible world of Springfield exists entirely inside the mind of a man who has been unconscious since April of 1993. This is the Homer coma theory. It is the most famous, most debated, and by a significant margin the most internally consistent fan theory in the history of The Simpsons. And when you hear it clearly, when you understand the evidence and follow the logic, it doesn't feel like speculation. It feels like the show's own shadow, the version of itself the show has been carrying since season 4, visible in certain light, invisible in others, always present even when nobody's looking directly at it. Let's start with what actually happened. The 1st of April 1993, the 18th episode of season 4. The title is So It's Come to This, a Simpsons clip show. The premise begins as a series of April Fool's pranks escalating between Bart and Homer. Bart takes one of Homer's beers to an auto body shop and places it inside an industrial paint shaker. He shakes it until the can is under tremendous internal pressure. He puts it back in the refrigerator. Homer, finding it later, opens it. The resulting explosion sends Homer to the hospital. While Homer is lying in his hospital bed recovering, he sees a vending machine across the room. He wants a candy bar. He tries to reach it. The vending machine tips over. It falls on him. And Homer Simpson, in a canonical episode with no dream sequence framing and no qualifying comedic distance, flatlines. He enters a clinically unconscious state, a real coma. The episode is not ambiguous about this. It shows you the monitors. It shows you the flatline. It shows you Homer's family gathered around his hospital bed, and it shows you 7 weeks passing while he lies there. The episode ends with what appears to be a resolution. Bart comes to Homer's bedside, tearful, and confesses that the whole thing was his fault. And Homer springs awake and immediately goes for Bart's throat in his signature strangling motion. The family laughs. Everything returns to normal. The show tells you he woke up. And then, in the final moments of the same episode, the show quietly tells you something else. Homer lost 5% of his brain function during the coma. The medical team tells him this directly. 5% permanently destroyed, never coming back. And Homer's response to learning that he is now irreversibly more brain damaged than he was before is to laugh inexplicably, not understanding why he's laughing. The family finds this charming. The episode ends. The Simpsons continues for 32 more years, unless Homer never woke up at all. The theory originally articulated on Reddit by a user whose account name was HardTopIcaname, which is as beautiful a detail as any the theory contains, is simple in its premise. Homer did not regain consciousness in April of 1993. The scene at the bedside, Bart's confession, Homer's awakening, all of it is part of the dream. Every single episode of The Simpsons that has aired since that date, across 3 decades of television, is the interior experience of a man lying in a hospital bed in Springfield General, slowly losing brain function, keeping himself alive through the sheer force of his love for the world he's left behind. Homer is dreaming his life. He has been dreaming it for 30-some years. And the dream, as dreams do, keeps going. It keeps getting stranger. It keeps expanding outward into territory further and further removed from the recognizable world that Homer went to sleep in. And nobody in the dream ever seems to notice thing is wrong, because in the dream, nothing is wrong. Because in the dream, the family is intact and the house is warm, and Homer always finds his way home by the end of the episode. The evidence for this theory is not circumstantial. It is structural. It is built into the bones of the show in ways that no executive producer's denial can fully account for. The first piece of evidence is the tonal shift. Before the coma episode, The Simpsons was a different show. Not completely different. It was always a cartoon, always comedic, always using exaggeration as a lens. But the storylines were grounded. They were about recognizable human experiences rendered through satire. Homer trying to quit alcohol, Marge considering infidelity, Lisa developing a crush, Bart facing academic failure, and the very real possibility of being held back a year. These are the stories of an actual family living in an actual community with actual financial pressures and actual emotional stakes. The human problems the show was exploring were the kind of problems that translate. You could watch them without having experienced them directly and still understand why they mattered. The show's emotional core was built on the currency of relatable struggle. After the coma episode, everything changes. Homer goes to space. Burns captures the Loch Ness Monster. Homer discovers his mother has been living as a fugitive radical for 27 years. Homer joins a secret society. Homer becomes the leader of a vigilante group. Homer meets God. Homer meets God again. Homer travels to dozens of countries. Homer holds dozens of different jobs. Homer befriends presidents and celebrities and historical figures. Homer survives things that would not just kill an ordinary human being, but would kill several of them simultaneously. The escalation is so dramatic and so consistent that even casual viewers noticed it. The question of when The Simpsons lost its grounding has been a topic of internet discussion for at least 2 decades. The standard answers involve changes in writing staff, changes in the show's aspirations, the natural entropy of a long-running series that has exhausted its initial premise and keeps expanding outward in search of new material. The coma theory offers a more elegant explanation. The show didn't lose its grounding. Homer's brain lost its grounding. And as it lost coherence, the dreams got bigger and stranger and further from the world Homer actually lived in, because that's what happens to dreams when the brain generating them is slowly deteriorating. They get more vivid, not less, more elaborate, more cinematic, more untethered from the material reality they originated in. Homer's unconscious mind, working with the reference library of his actual experiences and memories from before the coma, is building the grandest version of the life he wanted. The most exciting, most eventful, most full version. Because in the coma, there's no budget constraint. There's no physical limitation. There's no consequence that can't be undone by the next episode. Homer can go to space if his dreaming brain decides he should go to space. Homer can meet God if that's where the dream takes him. The only limitation on what can happen is the richness of Homer's imagination and the stability of the brain doing the dreaming. And as the brain slowly deteriorates, as the years in the coma accumulate, the stability decreases and the imagery gets stranger, which is exactly what fans have observed the show doing across 36 seasons. Now for the detail that makes the theory genuinely haunting. 6 months before the coma episode, Season 4, premiere. The episode is called Homer the Heretic. In it, Homer has a direct, face-to-face conversation with God. An actual conversation, not a symbolic one, not a dream framing, just Homer and God talking the way two people would talk if they happened to meet. And during that conversation, God tells Homer that he will learn the meaning of life, but not yet. God says Homer's time is coming. 6 months later, Homer is in a coma. The timeline matches with a precision that is difficult to explain as coincidence. God told Homer, in the 6th episode of Season 4, that his time was nearly up. In the 18th episode of the same season, Homer's conscious life ended. If you accept the coma theory, that earlier conversation stops being a charming theological gag and becomes a prophecy. God was telling Homer that his waking life was approaching its end, that what followed would be different from what came before. That the world Homer was about to enter the dream world, the coma world would eventually deliver him to some kind of understanding, even if the path there was long and strange and increasingly removed from anything recognizable as ordinary experience. God was giving Homer a heads up, and 6 months later, the vending machine fell. Let's address the aging problem, because this is the single point where the coma theory does something that no other explanation manages to do as cleanly. Nobody in The Simpsons ages. Bart has been 10 for 36 years. Lisa has been 8. Maggie has been 1. Homer and Marge have not gained a wrinkle or a gray hair since the show began. Every theory attempts to account for this. The radiation theory says the contamination has disrupted the biological mechanisms of aging. The cartoon logic explanation says it's simply a feature of the medium. Both of these are defensible, but the coma theory has the simplest answer, and it is the most emotionally affecting one. Nobody ages because they exist inside the frozen mind of a man who went to sleep in April of 1993 and never woke up. Homer's children can't age in the dream because his unconscious brain doesn't know how old they are now. When the coma took him, Bart was 10, Lisa was 8, Maggie was 1. Those are the versions of them that exist in Homer's memory banks. Those are the versions his dreaming mind can access. He doesn't know what Bart at 16 looks like. He doesn't know what Lisa at 24 sounds like. He never saw those things. He wasn't conscious to see them. So in the dream, the children are preserved at the ages they were when he last saw them, because that's the only data Homer's brain has to work with. Marge doesn't age because the last time Homer saw her, she looked exactly the way she looks in every episode. The same blue hair, the same patient expression, the same woman Homer fell in love with, and who was sitting beside his hospital bed when the vending machine fell. Homer's deepest love is frozen in his last clear memory of her. And in the dream, she stays that way. Because she has to. Because Homer's brain cannot generate an aged version of Marge without reference material it doesn't have. The same applies to every character in Springfield. They're all frozen at the age Homer last knew them. Because they're all Homer's memories, and Homer's projections, and Homer's longings, made into people-shaped objects, populating a dream world that is elaborate enough to feel real but organized, according to emotional logic rather than physical law. Every time someone survives something impossible in the dream, it's because the dream cannot kill them. Every time the world resets after a catastrophe, it's because dreams reset. Every time Homer makes it home by the end of the episode, it's because that's the only ending Homer's dreaming brain knows how to write. Not because he has narrative instincts. Because his deepest self wants the same thing every time. He wants to be home. He wants his family. He wants dinner on the table and the television on and Bart doing something infuriating and Marge asking how his day was and Maggie sitting in her high chair with her pacifier. He wants what he had on the last day he was conscious. And the dream gives it to him, over and over, in hundreds of variations. Across decades of television episodes, the dream gives him the only thing he ever really wanted. The celebrity appearances are worth a particular moment of attention. Later seasons of The Simpsons became famous for the quantity and variety of their celebrity guest appearances. Every prominent figure in American culture, musicians, athletes, politicians, actors, authors, seemed to pass through Springfield at some point. This struck many viewers as the show chasing cultural relevance rather than telling meaningful stories. The coma theory explains it differently. Homer's brain, lying in a hospital room, is not sealed off from the world. Sound comes through, voices from the television his family has running in the corner, conversations at his bedside, radio programs, names mentioned in passing by nurses and visitors, the ambient cultural signal of the world going on outside the room, penetrating the coma in fragments, and Homer's dreaming mind picks up those fragments, a name, a voice, a laugh, and weaves them into the dream as characters. The celebrity isn't visiting Springfield. The celebrity's name was mentioned on the hospital television, and Homer's brain converted it into a dream figure and gave it a walk-on role in the story he's telling himself about his life. The more time passes in the coma, the more of this ambient material accumulates. The longer Homer sleeps, the more voices have filtered through, the more names have been absorbed, the more the dream becomes populated with figures from the culture outside the hospital room. This is why later seasons feel like a different show. They're not just a different show. They're a different phase of the dream. One where the signal from the outside world has become more prominent, and Homer's grip on his internal narrative has become looser. The show has engaged with this theory directly, and the engagement is telling. In season 34, an episode called Lisa the Boy Scout includes what was presented as a deliberately leaked fake deleted scene. In this scene, Homer wakes up from a long coma, and it is revealed that every outlandish episode has been a dream. The show's writers created this scene, animated it, and released it to the public, and then claimed it was not actually from the episode, that it was a hoax planted by hackers. The official position was that it was a joke, an acknowledgement of the fan theory, not a confirmation of it. But think about what it takes to make that scene exist. The writers had to decide to engage with the theory. They had to write the scene, animate it, voice it, and release it. They put in the work. And what they chose to put in the work for was a scene in which the theory is confirmed, in which Homer wakes up and the dream ends and everything is revealed as exactly what the theory says it is. They made the true version of the ending. And then they called it a joke. Executive producer Al Jean addressed the theory directly in 2015. He said it's not true. He dismissed it as fan speculation and moved on. But Al Jean did not explain why nobody ages. He did not explain the tonal shift after season 4. He did not explain why God told Homer his time was coming in the premiere of the same season that contained the coma episode. He did not explain why the show gets progressively more surreal with each passing year, in exactly the pattern you'd expect from a dream being generated by a mind that is slowly losing its purchase on coherence. He said it's not true, and the conversation moved on. But fans didn't move on, because the theory does something that no official explanation has ever done. It makes everything make sense. The aging freeze, the tonal escalation, the celebrity flood, the reset button, the fact that Homer survives everything because nothing is actually happening to his body. His body is in the bed, only his mind is in Springfield. And his mind can't kill him because his mind is the one telling the story. There's a reading of this theory that is, when you sit with it long enough, genuinely beautiful. If the coma theory is true, then the emotional engine of The Simpsons is not comedy, it's love. Homer's deepest wish, the wish his dreaming mind is spending 30-some years trying to fulfill, is the simplest wish imaginable. He wants his family. He wants his children to still be young. He wants Marge to still love him. He wants to come home. He wants Friday night on the couch, and Saturday morning in the kitchen, and Sunday afternoon with a beer and the game on, and nothing in the world more complicated than whatever Bart has gotten himself into this week. He wants the life he was pulled away from, and the dream gives it to him. Every episode, every reset, every impossible survival, every time the credits roll and Springfield returns to normal, that's not lazy writing. That's Homer's brain refusing to let the story end. Because if the story ends, if the dream finally collapses, then Homer has to face what's waiting for him on the other side. He has to find out how much time has passed, how old his children really are, whether Marge is still there, whether anyone is still sitting by his bed, or worse, he doesn't wake up at all. The coma dream is not a nightmare. Within the logic of the theory, it is the closest thing to a heaven that a man like Homer Simpson would ever ask for. A house on Evergreen Terrace where the kids are always young and the refrigerator is always stocked and the couch is always warm and nobody ever has to say goodbye. And every episode you've watched since April of 1993 is a love letter, written by an unconscious father to the family he can't reach, delivered in the only medium available to him. The dreaming mind's best attempt to keep everyone he loves alive and together and safe in a world that was already starting to fall apart on the day the vending machine fell. The show will never confirm this, but it will never disprove it either, because the evidence isn't in the dialogue or the plot. It's in the structure. It's in the way the show is built, in the bones of it, in the 36 years of escalating strangeness and frozen time, and survived impossibilities that don't add up to anything coherent, unless you accept that the person generating the narrative is not operating in the normal world. Homer's coma isn't a theory about the show, it's a way of seeing the show, and once you've seen it that way, the comedy changes. Every time Homer laughs, you hear what's underneath it. Every time Marge says his name, you understand why that matters. Every time the episode ends and Springfield is fine and the family is together and nobody has left, you understand the arithmetic of that miracle. It's not that nothing bad can happen. It's that Homer's brain won't let the bad thing be permanent. Because permanence is the one thing the dream can't survive. Let that sit for a while. Let the images settle. The hospital room, the bed, the monitors, the family, the world outside going on without him, and inside his mind, Springfield, endlessly warm, endlessly present, endlessly waiting for him to come home. He always does. That's the whole point. He always does. End of Section 3. Section 4. Who really shot Mr. Burns? Before we go any further, we need to settle something. Or rather, we need to unsettle it. Because the official story of who shot Charles Montgomery Burns on the steps of the Springfield town sundial has been accepted as settled for nearly 30 years, and it shouldn't be. The evidence doesn't support the conclusion. The clues that were presented as decisive were explicitly described by the victim himself as coincidences. An alternate ending was fully animated and then dismissed with a line that was itself a reference to a famous trial where evidence was ignored to produce a desired verdict. And in season 18, the show's main character confessed to the shooting on camera without anyone responding. The case is not closed. Let's open it. The summer of 1995. The Simpsons executed something that had never been attempted by an animated show before, a genuine whodunit. A cliffhanger mystery designed with enough internal complexity that the show's creators felt comfortable inviting the American public to solve it through a national contest. Fox promoted the two-part episode like a cultural event. America's Most Wanted produced a tie-in special, treating the fictional shooting as if it were an actual unsolved crime. Springfield's Most Wanted. The premise was played completely straight, and the mystery was set up with care. By the end of part 1, Burns had done enough to give every significant character in the show a plausible motive. He'd stolen an oil well from beneath Springfield Elementary, destroying the school's budget. He'd financially ruined Moe's Tavern. He'd created a sinkhole that collapsed the Springfield retirement castle. He'd injured Santa's little helper. And for his grand finale, he'd constructed a mechanical disc large enough to block out the sun over the entire town, not metaphorically, literally, actually blocking the sun so that Springfield's residents would have no choice but to purchase their electricity from his plant. When Smithers, his personal assistant of decades, protested, Burns fired him on the spot. The episode ends with Burns shot and collapsing onto the town's sundial, his hands falling onto two letters, W and S. From Burns's own perspective, looking down at the sundial from above, the letters would read M and S. America waited through the summer. Part 2 aired in September 1995. The investigation was played as comedy chief Wiggum fumbling through the case, suspects being eliminated one by one, Smithers confessing and then having his confession invalidated by evidence that he'd actually shot someone else entirely while blackout drunk. The DNA evidence emerged, an eyelash found on Burns's suit. Analyzed, the eyelash belongs to a Simpson. Homer had the clearest motive, the most volatile emotional history with Burns, and his fingerprints were on the gun. The investigation converged on Homer. He was about to be convicted. Burns woke up from his own coma. He identified his attacker. It was Maggie, baby Maggie Simpson. Burns described an encounter in the parking lot after the town meeting where he attempted to take Maggie's lollipop. In the struggle, his gun fell from his holster. Maggie picked it up. The gun discharged. Burns was shot. Case closed. Baby did it. Except. Let's start with the contest. The show invited viewers across America to submit their guesses. The prize being animated into a future episode was significant. Thousands of entries were submitted, and according to the DVD commentary for the episodes, not a single person from the randomly selected sample of entries submitted the correct answer. Nobody won. The prize was given to a randomly selected entrant who, not having guessed correctly, received a cash consolation payment instead. The writers mention on the commentary that they were aware of exactly one person who had posted the correct answer online, on a Simpsons newsgroup, on the night the first part aired. But this person was using a college internet account. By the time the show tried to track them down, the account had been deactivated. They were never found. Think about what this means. A national contest was built around the premise that the mystery was solvable from the clues embedded in Part 1. The show's creators promoted it on those grounds. And when the answer was revealed, essentially nobody had gotten there. Either the clues were insufficient, the red herrings were too effective, or the answer didn't follow from the evidence the way the show implied it would. The show's own contest suggests the solution was not actually derivable from the clues presented. Now, the sundial. Burns falls. His hands land on W and S, or, from his perspective, M and S, Maggie Simpson. The show presents this as the central piece of physical evidence pointing to the shooter's identity, and Burns himself, in his account of the shooting, explicitly states that the way his hands landed on the sundial was not intentional. He didn't position himself. He fell. The letters were a coincidence. He says this on the record, within the show's own narrative. The central piece of evidence, the single most prominent clue in the most discussed mystery in the show's history, was described by the victim as meaningless, as an accident of the way a shot man happened to collapse. Burns told the investigation directly that his hands on those letters didn't mean anything, and the investigation used those letters as primary evidence anyway. Then there's the gun. Burns carried a firearm in a holster. The holster was shown, at some point before the shooting, to be empty. The gun was already gone before the attack. Whoever shot Burns used a weapon that was already missing from the person who should have been carrying it. This tells us something important. The shooter was not someone who brought their own weapon to the town meeting. Most of the characters at that meeting were shown carrying weapons because they were angry enough to consider violence and had come prepared for it. The person who shot Burns was someone who wasn't armed, who encountered Burns's gun by chance and used it in the moment. A baby finding a gun on the ground fits that profile. So does a significant number of other characters. But the point is that the physical circumstances of the shooting describe an impulsive, unplanned act by someone who didn't arrive at the meeting intending to shoot anyone. Burns's last words before the shooting were, "Oh, it's you." He recognized his attacker. He wasn't startled or frightened. He spoke with the register of someone greeting a familiar acquaintance, someone he knew but didn't consider a threat. Does Burns recognize Maggie Simpson? Has he interacted with her in any meaningful way prior to that evening? The show doesn't establish a relationship between Burns and Maggie. Burns barely remembers Homer, a man who has worked for him for decades. The idea that Burns would see a 1-year-old child in a parking lot and respond with the calm recognition of, "Oh, it's you," as if acknowledging a person he knows doesn't square with what we understand about how Burns relates to the world. He knows his attacker. His tone suggests familiarity, not surprise. These are the words of someone encountering a person they've dealt with before, someone they have history with. A baby is not that person. Season 18. Homer is in a conversation. The specifics are somewhat beside the point, and he claims, out loud, on camera, in a canonical episode with no dream framing and no qualifying narrative distance, that he was the one who shot Burns. He just says it. The show doesn't respond to this confession. Nobody investigates. Nobody reopens the case. The richest man in Springfield was shot. Homer confesses to it years later, and the moment passes without a ripple. Either Homer is lying. It wouldn't be the first time Homer said something dramatic about himself for attention that turned out to be false. But the detail is interesting. Why that specific claim? Why that specific crime? Why would Homer choose the shooting of Mr. Burns as the false confession he decides to make in casual conversation? The lie, if it is a lie, has a specificity that casual lies usually don't, or Homer is telling the truth. And if Homer is telling the truth, then Maggie was blamed for something her father did. A baby was used as a convenient explanation for a crime committed by an adult, because a baby cannot be prosecuted, because, as Chief Wiggum himself observed, no jury in the world would convict an infant. Maggie was the perfect fall guy. Too young to deny the accusation in any meaningful way. Too young to understand what she was being accused of. Too young to ever be punished. The Marge theory is worth examining because it has, among the alternate readings, the strongest structural support. Marge had been subjected to Burns's infatuation in a previous episode, the one where she briefly worked at the plant. Burns had fallen for her in that episode, and that infatuation, while played for comedy, established a dynamic between them. The theory argues that Burns, having been shot by Marge, recognized her and chose not to identify her, protected her. He woke from his coma, understood what had happened, and rather than name the woman he'd been fixated on, he let his gaze fall on the sundial and allowed the town to draw its own conclusions from 2 letters that, as he himself said, meant nothing. The final shot of part 2 shows Maggie alone in the room after everyone has gone. She looks around, checking her surroundings, confirming she's not being watched. And then she moves her pacifier in a motion that mimics pulling a trigger. The show presents this as confirmation as a baby's private acknowledgement of the act she committed. But it's equally readable as a baby imitating something she witnessed. Maggie was in that parking lot. She saw what happened. And she's doing what babies do when they've seen something significant. She's replaying it. The motion isn't a confession. It's a memory. The alternate ending was fully animated. The show produced a complete, voiced, fully realized conclusion in which Smithers is revealed as the shooter. They showed it in a clip show hosted by Troy McClure, who dismissed it by saying it wouldn't have made sense. because the DNA evidence would have to be ignored and then explicitly compared ignoring DNA evidence to the O.J. Simpson trial verdict. The show is winking. It's telling you that ignoring evidence to reach a preferred conclusion happens. It's telling you that official answers and correct answers are not always the same thing. The writers also considered Barney Gumble as the shooter at an early draft stage. They planned to send him to prison. They cycled through multiple shooters before landing on Maggie, which means the answer was not predetermined by the clues. The clues were written after the answer was chosen, adjusted to fit whatever shooter the writers eventually settled on. The mystery was constructed in reverse. It was engineered to have a specific solution, but the engineering was incomplete, hence a national contest in which essentially nobody arrived at the intended answer. Here's the question that the show has never been asked and certainly never answered. In a town where every significant character had a motive, where the victim had committed acts against the entire community, where multiple people were already carrying weapons at the town meeting, why is it accepted without question that only one person acted? Springfield is a town where riots break out over minor misunderstandings, where mobs form spontaneously over trivial disputes, where collective anger tends toward immediate and disproportionate physical expression. But when Burns blocks out the literal sun and threatens the survival of everything living in the town, only one person pulls a trigger? Either Springfield became, on that specific night, significantly more restrained than at any other point in its history, or the shooting was less spontaneous than the official story suggests, or there were more shots fired and the evidence of the others was cleaned up before the investigation began. Someone with access to Burns's schedule, knowledge of his gun, familiarity with the route Burns would take leaving the town meeting, the ability to ensure that the investigation pointed somewhere convenient, someone with all of those things and a reason to use them? Who in Springfield had all of those things? The official answer is a baby who found a gun on the ground. The evidence suggests something more complicated, and the show, for all its insistence that the case is settled, keeps leaving doors ajar. Homer's unchallenged confession, the alternate ending that explicitly references a famous case of evidence being ignored. The victim's own statement that the sundial was coincidence. The one piece of canonical evidence that pointed to an adult Simpson and was interpreted as pointing to the infant member of the family instead. The greatest mystery in Simpsons history was not solved. It was closed. And in Springfield, as we will continue to discover, those are two entirely different things. Rest here for a moment. Let the case breathe. In Springfield, the truth has a way of surfacing eventually, even in the towns that have made forgetting into law. Even where the official answer is protected by consensus and convenience and the legal immunity of infancy, the truth about Burns's shooting is out there somewhere, encoded in the evidence the show provided and the evidence the show quietly buried. And like everything in Springfield, it connects to everything else. To the system, to Burns, to the family that was never supposed to ask the right questions. We'll keep following the threads. End of Section 4. Section 5. The Immortality of Charles Montgomery Burns. Charles Montgomery Burns is, depending on which episode you consult and which timeline you trust, somewhere between 100 and 140 years old. The show has never committed to a precise number, which is itself a choice, and a deliberate one, but the lower bound is established firmly enough that the upper bound becomes almost irrelevant. Burns is, by any reasonable measure, far older than any human being should be. He has described personal memories of events from before the turn of the 20th century. He has referenced working relationships with historical figures who died decades before most of his current employees were born. He attended Yale. He served in the Second World War, though the nature of his service was morally complicated in ways the show hints at without fully exploring. He knew Howard Hughes. He stole $1 trillion bill from the United States government during the war and kept it hidden for decades, which implies a relationship with power structures at the federal level that predates most of living memory. He has described the Gilded Age not as history, but as lived experience, a period of personal recollection, something he witnessed rather than something he read about. And yet here he is, running a multi-billion-dollar corporation, manipulating municipal politics with precision, orchestrating schemes that require sustained cognitive effort, long-term strategic planning, and a working understanding of contemporary law, contemporary finance, and contemporary technology. His body is frail visibly, almost comically frail, but his mind is not. His mind is razor-sharp, analytically precise, strategically ruthless in ways that no one in Springfield can match. He is, by almost any measure, the most cognitively capable person in the town, operating at a level of sustained intellectual function that most people don't maintain into their 70s, let alone their hundreds. How? The show addresses this question in the same episode that produced the clearest piece of evidence for the radiation theory, the Springfield Files. Burns, we learn, undergoes a weekly medical treatment. The treatment is so intensive, so loaded with experimental chemicals and radiation therapy, that it leaves Burns in a dazed, glowing, barely coherent state for hours afterward. He wanders out of the facility after each session like someone emerging from a fever, stumbling, luminous, not quite present. The people who encounter him in the woods mistake him for an extraterrestrial. The treatment keeps him alive for exactly 7 more days. Without it, he dies. The margin for error is 0. One missed appointment, 1 week without the intervention, and the equilibrium that keeps Burns functional collapses. He does not have the kind of relationship with mortality that a normal human being has, where health is a default state interrupted by illness. Burns's relationship with mortality is the reverse. He exists in a state of ongoing crisis that his medical protocol is continuously managing. The treatments don't heal him. They maintain a condition that would otherwise be immediately fatal. He is, in a very real sense, kept alive by machinery. The machinery just happens to be biological and chemical rather than mechanical. This is not, in the show's presentation, played for horror. It's a punchline. The explanation for why Homer saw a glowing man in the woods, the mystery resolved, the laughs collected, the episode moving on to other things. But sit with the actual information for a moment. Charles Montgomery Burns, a man who is well over a century old, cannot survive without weekly radiation therapy. His body cannot sustain itself through normal biological processes. He requires external radiation input the way a normal body requires food and water. Without it, his system shuts down within 7 days. Burns is not just profiting from radiation, he is powered by it. This explains something that receives very little direct examination in the show's 36 years. The question of Burns's immune system. In one of the most famous scenes in the entire series, a scene that is quoted and referenced constantly as a piece of comedy, Burns is examined by a doctor who delivers extraordinary news. Burns has every disease known to medical science. Every single one, simultaneously, all present in his body at once. But they exist, the doctor explains, in a state of perfect equilibrium, each disease canceling out the others. Every illness in his body is trying to kill him, and because they're all trying to kill him at the same time, none of them can. They're blocking each other in the doorway. The medical term the doctor provides is Three Stooges syndrome. 3 entities all trying to move through the same opening at once, creating a gridlock that prevents any of them from progressing. The conclusion: Burns is the sickest man in the United States. He is also functionally indestructible, because every force that should kill him is perfectly neutralized by every other force that should kill him. This is played for laughs. It is one of the show's most quoted scenes. But if you take the radiation theory seriously, if you accept that Burns's medical condition is the result of decades of managed radiation exposure rather than bad luck, then the Three Stooges syndrome stops being absurd and starts being something that makes a specific kind of sense. The weekly radiation treatments aren't curing Burns's diseases, they're managing them. They're maintaining the precise balance that keeps every illness in his body in perfect stasis, preventing any single condition from gaining dominance, and killing him before the next treatment can be administered. It's not medicine in any conventional sense. It's calibration. Burns's body is a system, and the weekly treatments are the equivalent of adjusting the control mechanisms to prevent any one variable from overwhelming the others. He is, in the most literal possible sense, treating himself like a reactor. The man who owns a nuclear power plant, who has spent a century managing radioactive materials, who has built his entire fortune on the controlled use of nuclear energy, has internalized the logic of that management into his own biological maintenance. He is his own reactor. His medical team are his control engineers. Smithers is the operator who makes sure the scheduled maintenance never gets missed. Smithers. This is where the immortality theory gets its most human dimension. Wayland Smithers Jr. is the most loyal employee in the history of employment. His devotion to Burns is one of the show's most sustained running elements comic, occasionally poignant, repeatedly revealed to be more complicated than a simple workplace relationship. The show has, over the years, offered various framings for what drives Smithers' loyalty. Love, in some form. Obligation. A kind of identity-level investment in Burns' well-being that goes beyond professional duty into something more fundamental. But the radiation theory suggests an additional layer. Smithers manages Burns' medical schedule. Smithers ensures every weekly treatment is administered on time. Smithers monitors Burns' condition with a vigilance that borders on obsession and that the show has established repeatedly would be irreplaceable if Smithers were to leave. Not emotionally irreplaceable, functionally irreplaceable. Without Smithers managing the treatment protocol, Burns would miss a dose. The disease equilibrium would collapse, the gridlock would break, every illness in his body would surge simultaneously. Smithers isn't devoted to Burns out of sentiment alone. Smithers knows that his departure is a death sentence. He understands this, consciously or not, and that understanding is the weight that keeps him in place no matter how badly Burns treats him. The loyalty isn't just loyalty. It's the knowledge that he is the single point of failure in a system whose collapse would be immediate and total. Smithers is keeping Burns alive through administrative competence, and that competence is the foundation on which a century and more of Burns' existence rests. Burns' relationship with historical events adds a dimension to the immortality question that the show gestures toward without fully exploring. The depth of his personal history is staggering when you inventory it. He served in the Second World War, which means he was old enough for military service sometime before 1945, suggesting a birth date no later than the mid-1920s at the absolute most recent. And the show's dialogue consistently implies a much earlier date. He attended Yale, which at the minimum level of enrollment age places his undergraduate years in the 1920s or before. He knew Howard Hughes personally, which requires a functional adult presence sometime before Hughes's death in 1976, but more relevantly, a social proximity to Hughes during his active years in the mid-20th century. He has described the Gilded Age as personal experience. The Gilded Age ended around 1900. If Burns experienced it as a conscious adult, he was born in the 1880s at the latest. He would be, at minimum, somewhere around 140 years old by the show's present day. And the Burns family history extends further back still. The show has depicted the Burns dynasty as one of the most consistently powerful lineages in American history, not just wealthy, but foundationally wealthy. The kind of wealth that was present at the construction of the nation's basic economic infrastructure. They didn't accumulate their fortune. They were the framework within which others accumulated theirs. The kind of family whose name is on institutions that no longer remember how the name got there. Whether previous Burns patriarchs employed strategies similar to the current one's managed radiation treatments is something the show never explores directly. But the question is interesting. Before nuclear medicine, before the kind of experimental radiation therapy that currently keeps Burns alive, how did the Burns dynasty maintain the continuity of a fortune that predates the American experiment? What mechanisms existed earlier that served the same function? The show leaves this open. It establishes the duration of the dynasty's power and then declines to explain how a single family maintained control over multiple centuries without any apparent break in succession. Some things in Springfield are left as open questions. The Burns family's true history is one of them. What the show does tell us clearly is the structure of Burns's relationship with death. He has been shot. He has been hospitalized dozens of times. He has been poisoned, abandoned in the wilderness, attacked, collapsed, come closer to dying than almost any other character in the show's history. And every single time he comes back. Not through the cartoon resilience that lets Homer walk away from a building collapse. Homer survives through the show's implicit agreement that main characters don't die. Burns survives through infrastructure. Through the application of wealth so enormous that it can reconstruct whatever damage has been done and resume the maintenance schedule that keeps him functional. Homer's immortality is passive. The show just decides he survives. Burns's immortality is engineered. Every institution he's corrupted, every politician he's purchased, every doctor he's retained, every research program he funds, it all serves the same ultimate purpose. Keep Burns alive. Keep the treatments coming. Keep the diseases balanced. Keep the reactor running. Because if Burns dies, the system he spent a century and more building dies with him, and systems of that size do not allow themselves to die. Here's the detail that makes the Burns immortality question genuinely unsettling rather than just philosophically interesting. Springfield needs Burns. This is not sentiment, it's economics. The plant provides the electricity. The plant provides the employment. The plant's tax base funds the municipal infrastructure. Burns's wealth funds political campaigns, which means his preferences shape local government. His influence touches the school, the hospital, the police department, the judiciary. Remove Burns from the equation, and you don't get a town freed from oppression. You get a town that can't keep its lights on. Burns and Springfield are locked in a dependency that serves Burns's interests and traps Springfield's population in a relationship it cannot exit without destroying itself. The town cannot kill Burns because the town cannot survive without Burns. And Burns cannot die, because dying would mean the system he spent a century building finally has to answer for what it's done. The contamination, the violations, the three-eyed fish, the human skeletons in the basement, the safety inspector with a crayon in his brain. All of it would surface, and all of it would be traceable to decisions Burns made and maintained for decades. Burns's immortality is not a mystery. It's a necessity. He is too expensive to die. The cost of his death in legal liability, in regulatory exposure, in the collapse of the economic infrastructure that depends on him, is more than Springfield can afford to pay. So the treatments keep coming, week after week, dose after dose, maintaining the equilibrium that keeps the most dangerous man in Springfield alive for another 7 days, and another 7 days after that, and another 7 days after that, in an infinite series of weeks that add up to a lifetime longer than any institution in the town he controls. He is not immortal. He is not supernatural. He is the logical endpoint of what happens when wealth accumulates without constraint, and is applied, with a century of experience, to the single goal of ensuring its own continuation. He doesn't cheat death, he pays for it, and Springfield keeps paying the bill. End of Section 5. Section 6. Maggie Simpson, the most dangerous person in Springfield. Of all the secrets Springfield has been keeping, this one is the most carefully hidden. Not because the show buries it under misdirection or wraps it in narrative complexity, because the secret is Maggie Simpson, and Maggie Simpson has been hiding herself. She is 1 year old. She has been 1 year old for 36 years. She communicates through facial expressions, pacifier noises, and the occasional pointed stare. She has not developed language in any meaningful public way, the exception being a single word, daddy, voiced once by a celebrity guest and never repeated. She crawls and falls and toddles and takes small tumbles, performing the motor limitations of infancy so consistently and so convincingly that everyone around her has settled into the assumption that she is exactly what she appears to be, a baby, dependent, limited, operating at the developmental level her physical age suggests. She is none of those things. Let's inventory what Maggie Simpson has actually done in 36 years of appearing to be incapable of doing anything. She shot Charles Montgomery Burns, the richest and most powerful man in Springfield, under circumstances that required her to pick up a weapon, aim it, and discharge it at a specific target. Regardless of what you conclude about the larger mystery of the shooting, regardless of whether you accept the official answer or lean toward one of the alternate theories we explored earlier, the investigation at its conclusion identified Maggie as the person responsible, and the evidence used to support that identification was not nothing. She was in the right place. She had access to the weapon, and the final shot of the episode shows her alone in a room after everyone has left, checking that she is unobserved before mimicking the act of firing. That sequence of actions checking surroundings, confirming the absence of witnesses, then performing a private reenactment of a significant event requires a level of situational awareness, memory, caution, and impulse control that infants do not possess. Infants do not check that they're alone before doing things. They don't perform private reenactments. They don't have the metacognitive architecture to understand that some behaviors are appropriate to perform publicly and others only privately. That's not an infant's behavior. That's the behavior of a conscious, self-aware entity who understands consequences. Then there is the longest daycare. A theatrical short film released in 2012, nominated for an Academy Award, 7 minutes long. The premise: Maggie is dropped off at the Ayn Rand School for Tots, a daycare facility of near-totalitarian efficiency. Inside the facility, Maggie encounters a caterpillar on the verge of transformation. She wants to protect it. Another child, a persistent antagonist named Gerald, wants to destroy it. What follows is a miniature action film in which Maggie, without words, without adult assistance, without any resource other than her own cognitive capacity, outwits the bully, navigates the facility's security measures, protects the chrysalis through the transformation, and releases the butterfly into the open air. She does this entirely through observation, planning, improvisation, and adaptive problem-solving. She reads the environment for threats and opportunities. She identifies solutions on the fly when initial approaches fail. She executes multi-step plans that require timing, spatial reasoning, and the ability to model other people's behavior accurately enough to predict and counter it. Her body barely cooperates. She falls. She stumbles. Her motor skills are genuinely those of a 1-year-old. The physical limitations are real, and the film doesn't hide them. But her decision-making throughout is essentially flawless. Every choice is correct. Every adaptation is optimal. She is constrained by a body that can't keep up with her mind, but her mind is doing things that no infant's mind does. She is operating at a cognitive level that her physical development cannot support. And she succeeds anyway, because her intelligence, whatever is generating it, is more than sufficient to compensate. The show has tested Maggie's intelligence directly in various episodes. The results vary, which is itself interesting. Some episodes place her intelligence in the exceptional range. Others push it to levels that standardized testing can't adequately measure. But the pattern across all of these tests is consistent. Maggie is not a normal baby. She consistently demonstrates cognitive abilities that no 1-year-old should possess. And the people around her consistently fail to notice, because they're too busy with whatever is happening in the foreground. Homer's disasters, Bart's mischief, Lisa's crusades to pay attention to the silent infant in the corner, who appears to be doing nothing but sitting there. Which brings us to the defining characteristic, not the intelligence, the silence. Maggie doesn't speak. This is not developmental delay in the traditional sense. The show has made clear, across 36 years, that Maggie is capable of communication beyond her limited public vocabulary. She said "daddy" once. She has communicated meaningfully through gesture, expression, and action in dozens of contexts. The silence is not inability. The show has given us enough evidence to conclude that the silence is a choice. Why would an intelligent being choose silence? Look at what happens to the intelligent women in this family. Lisa Simpson is brilliant. Lisa is a genius, an actual documented genius with an IQ that towers over everyone in her household and most of the adults she encounters. She has been gifted with the kind of mind that, in a functioning meritocracy, would open every door. She plays an instrument beautifully. She reasons carefully and honestly. She cares about the world in ways that produce both insight and action. She is, by any objective measure, one of the most exceptional people Springfield has ever produced. And what has that exceptional intelligence actually delivered? Isolation, mockery, dismissal. Lisa speaks up and gets ignored. Lisa challenges authority and faces punishment. Lisa tries to improve the world around her, and the world around her resists with a consistency that borders on coordination. Lisa's intelligence is her defining quality, and it is simultaneously the primary reason she is lonely, because she uses it visibly. She announces herself as the smartest person in the room. She can't help it, she's 8 years old, and the intelligence feels urgent, feels important, feels like it should matter. And the room responds, every time, by demonstrating that it does not. Maggie has watched this. Maggie has been watching this since she was born. She has observed, across the entirety of her conscious existence, what happens when a woman in this family deploys her intelligence publicly and demands to be taken seriously. She has seen the outcome. She has conducted what amounts to an ongoing observational study of the relationship between visible intelligence and social consequences in the Simpson household and in Springfield generally. And she drew the opposite conclusion from Lisa's. Lisa's lesson was, keep fighting regardless of the cost. Maggie's lesson was, the cost is too high. The lesson Maggie internalized from watching her sister is that intelligence displayed is intelligence penalized. That the smart approach in a world that punishes insight is to conceal the insight. To perform the role everyone expects you to perform and accomplish your actual goals in the margins, below the radar, in the spaces where no one is paying enough attention to notice. Silence is not Maggie's limitation. Silence is Maggie's armor. The pacifier is not a comfort object. It's a prop, an element of the costume she wears to maintain the disguise that allows her to operate without interference from a family and a community that would otherwise attempt to manage, contain, or simply ignore whatever she was doing. Think about what the disguise achieves. Every time Maggie does something remarkable, what happens? The family doesn't notice. The community doesn't notice. Burns was shot, and the investigation focused on every adult in Springfield before anyone thought to look at the baby in the parking lot because who suspects a baby? The daycare rebellion succeeded partly because adults don't monitor infants closely enough to see them organizing. Every heroic act, every display of extraordinary cognitive function, every moment where Maggie solves a problem that has defeated the adults around her, it happens in the margins, in the spaces where the eye of the town isn't directed. And Maggie has constructed those spaces deliberately by maintaining the single most effective disguise available to her. She pretends to be exactly what everyone expects a one-year-old to be. Quiet, passive, limited, dependent, the infant version of helplessness. She is none of those things. She has never been any of those things. She has been, for 36 years, the most capable member of the Simpson family, running a sustained deception so complete that even the show's audience is sometimes uncertain whether to take her seriously. This is where the radiation theory and the Maggie theory intersect in an interesting way. If Springfield's contaminated environment produces mutations, and we've established that the evidence for this is considerable, and if those mutations affect each person differently based on their individual biological response, then Maggie and Homer represent the two poles of the distribution. Homer's mutation reduced his cognitive function to a level the show describes as clinical disability. Maggie's mutation went the other direction entirely, amplifying her cognitive capacity to a level that the show can't quite quantify. Same water, same air, same family, same cracked cooling towers on the horizon. The father's brain diminished. The daughter's augmented. Homer and Maggie are the same radiation exposure producing opposite effects. One person made less than what they might have been, the other made more. If the coma theory is also true, then Maggie takes on an additional dimension that is harder to bear. If everything since April 1993 is Homer's dream, if every episode is Homer's unconscious mind building a world from the raw material of his memories and his longings, then Maggie's brilliance is Homer's deepest hope for his youngest child, expressed in the only form available to him. He can't see her grow up. He can't watch her develop in real time. He can't hear her speak or see her walk or find out what kind of person she becomes out in the actual world. The coma has taken all of that from him. So in the dream, he gives her everything. He makes her extraordinary. He makes her capable of things no baby could do. He gives her an intelligence that transcends her developmental stage. Because in his dream, Homer needs to believe that his smallest, most vulnerable child will be able to take care of herself. Her genius in that reading is not a mutation. It's a prayer. The prayer of an unconscious father who can't be there to protect her and is trying to make her strong enough to protect herself. But return to the waking world for a moment. Return to Springfield as a place rather than a dream. And sit with the question the show has never answered. What is Maggie waiting for? She watches. She has always watched. She absorbs everything, every conflict, every revelation, every secret that plays out in front of her because the adults in the room have forgotten she's there and capable of understanding them. She has been collecting information about Springfield for 36 years. She knows things about her family, her neighbors, her town that no one else knows because no one else was paying attention in the specific moments when Maggie was present and absorbing. She has demonstrated that she can act on what she knows and act effectively. The Burns shooting, the daycare rebellion, the repeated instances of protecting her family from dangers that the family itself wasn't aware of until after Maggie had already resolved them. She has shown over and over that when she decides the moment is right, she can move with a precision and effectiveness that the other members of her family cannot match. But mostly she waits. She doesn't reveal the intelligence. She doesn't break the silence. She maintains the disguise and continues the observation, and continues collecting whatever it is she's collecting, building toward whatever she's building toward, waiting for whatever she's waiting for. The show has never told us what the end game is. It has never given us Maggie's plan, because Maggie has never shared it, not with her family, not with the audience, not with anyone. The plan exists only behind those enormous eyes, behind the pacifier, in the part of Maggie's extraordinary mind that she has, with complete consistency across 36 years, declined to share with anyone. That's not a baby. That's a strategist. And maybe the scariest thing about Maggie isn't what she's done. It's what she's waiting to do. The accumulated evidence of 36 years of observation, of silent information gathering, of building a map of Springfield's secrets that no one else has assembled at some point, that accumulation becomes something. At some point, the intelligence looking out from behind that pacifier decides that the moment has arrived. Springfield won't see it coming, because Springfield has never seen Maggie coming. Not once. Not ever. Because that's exactly how Maggie designed it, over 36 years of careful, patient, completely deliberate silence. The most powerful person on Evergreen Terrace is the one everyone forgot to watch. End of Section 6. Section 7. Mona Simpson and the Conspiracy Against Homer. For the first 6 seasons of The Simpsons, Homer's mother was dead. This was the established fact of Homer's backstory. Mona Simpson had passed away when Homer was a child. Abe Simpson, Homer's father, had told him this. He had taken young Homer to a grave. He had let the boy mourn. He had allowed his son to grow up understanding himself as a boy whose mother had died, and whose father was too emotionally distant to fill the void she left. That foundational loss shaped Homer Simpson in ways the show has explored across decades. His desperate need for approval. His clinginess toward Marge, which contains, underneath the comedy, a real terror of abandonment, the fear that the people he loves most will one day simply not be there. His willingness to absorb humiliation from his employer rather than risk losing the one stable structure in his life. His compulsive need to be liked, to be included, to belong to something, to not be the person someone leaves. Homer's emotional architecture is the architecture of a child who was told his mother chose to die rather than stay with him. Even though he was never told that directly, even though the official story was simply that she died, that's the emotional logic a child draws when their mother is gone and the father doesn't explain. And the years pass and the grave stays and nobody comes home. Something must have been wrong with me. Something must have made her not want to stay. This belief shaped everything. Homer's personality is, at its root, a coping mechanism for a wound that was never allowed to heal because the wound was sustained on a false premise. In Season 7, the show revealed that the premise was false. The episode is Mother Simpson. Homer, in an attempt to avoid working on a Saturday, fakes his death. The scheme involves pushing a dummy off a cliff and allowing the town to believe he has died. When Marge insists he go to the Hall of Records to correct the error to officially undie, as it were, Homer discovers something in the municipal records that changes everything. His mother is alive. She never died. The grave Abe had taken him to as a child was not hers. It was the grave of a poet named Walt Whitman. The show uses a rhyming alternate version of the name for copyright reasons, but the implication is clear. Abe had been passing off a famous writer's headstone as his wife's burial site for the entirety of Homer's life, and Homer had been mourning a woman who was not dead in front of a grave that was not hers. Homer finds Mona at a cemetery. She's visiting what she believes is her son's grave, because as far as she knew, Homer had died. The town's announcement of his death had reached her. She doesn't recognize him at first. He's grown into the person he became during the 27 years of her absence, a person she had no part in shaping, a stranger in the body of the child she kissed goodbye. But when he proves who he is, the reunion happens. And then Mona tells Homer the truth. She didn't leave because she wanted to. She didn't leave because something about Homer made her want to go. She left because she had to. Because staying would have put Homer and Abe in danger. Because the man who owned the power plant, the man Homer would grow up to work for, the man who signs Homer's paychecks, The man whose name Homer is constitutionally unable to remember for any sustained period had destroyed her life and forced her underground. The story begins in 1969. Mona Simpson was, at the start, ordinary. A housewife in Springfield, married to Abe, mother to a young Homer. She was not extraordinary. She was not a radical. She was a woman living the domestic life of her era, in a mid-size American town. During a period when the world outside was burning through social upheaval, she was watching from a distance. And then she was radicalized. The show depicts this through a sequence that is played with characteristic absurdity but genuine emotional sincerity. Mona joined a group of activists. The show describes them as hippies, but their cause was legitimate. They were targeting a biological weapons laboratory owned by Mr. Burns, a laboratory in Springfield where Burns was conducting research into weaponized pathogens, not as part of government contract work, as a private enterprise, a billionaire manufacturing biological weapons in a residential community. Mona and her group broke into the facility. They detonated what the show calls an antibiotic bomb, destroying the biological agent stored inside. The raid was successful, the weapons were eliminated, but in the chaos of the group's escape, Mona stopped. She stopped to help someone who had been knocked down in the confusion. That someone was Burns. She stopped to help the man whose weapons she had just destroyed, and Burns saw her face. He identified her. He reported her to the FBI. And from that moment forward, Mona Simpson was a fugitive. She couldn't go home. She couldn't contact her family. She couldn't hold her son or explain to him what was happening or why she had to leave. She kissed Homer goodbye while he was sleeping and vanished into the night. For 27 years, Homer woke up and his mother was gone. Abe told him she was dead. And Homer spent the next 3 decades of his life believing, on some foundational level, that he was the kind of person a mother would choose to leave. That there was something wrong with him that made people go. Now map the full architecture of what Burns did. Burns ran a biological weapons laboratory in Springfield. He was running it at the same time he was running the nuclear plant with 342 safety violations. He was manufacturing weaponized pathogens while leaking radiation into the community's water supply. He was doing these things simultaneously, in the same town, with what the show's evidence suggests was complete impunity from any regulatory or legal consequence. When Mona destroyed his weapons, Burns didn't just report her to the FBI, he pursued her. Across decades, the show makes this explicit. When Mona finally returns to Springfield in Season 7, Burns recognizes her almost immediately. He spots her through a cab window. He calls the authorities. The FBI arrives at the Simpson house. Mona has to flee again, and Homer has to say goodbye to his mother for the second time, now understanding why she left and who drove her away. Burns held a personal grudge for 27 years against a woman who had destroyed his weapons. He used the resources at his disposal, his political connections, his relationship with federal law enforcement, the infrastructure of wealth that lets a man like Burns make things happen without leaving traceable fingerprints to ensure Mona Simpson could never come home, could never return to her husband, could never see her son. And the son grew up working for the man who took his mother. Homer earns his paycheck from the specific person who stole his childhood. Who created the wound that made Homer the damaged, needy, approval-seeking, authority-compliant person he is? Who engineered, through the single act of reporting Mona to the FBI, the exact psychological profile that makes Homer the perfect plant employee, unable to leave, unable to resist, unable to connect the dots between the suffering in his life and the man who caused it? Homer, when he learns all of this, does not connect the dots. He doesn't confront Burns. He doesn't quit. He doesn't even seem to fully process the relationship between the billionaire he works for and the billionaire who took his mother. He knows both facts. He has both pieces of information. He cannot assemble them into a coherent picture. The radiation theory has an answer for why. The coma theory has an answer for why. But the simplest answer is that Homer is a man whose capacity for this kind of systemic reasoning was destroyed by the same system he's trying to reason about. The contamination, the crayon, the decades of cognitive erosion. He cannot see the pattern because the pattern specifically required that he lose the ability to see it. Burns didn't just take Homer's mother. He engineered the conditions that would prevent Homer from ever understanding what was taken. The conspiracy deepens when you add the deal. In a later episode, the show reveals that Burns and Abe Simpson made a specific agreement. Burns had committed a crime, the nature of which the show leaves somewhat ambiguous, though the general shape is clear enough, and Abe witnessed it. In exchange for Abe's silence, Burns made a guarantee. Homer would have a job at the plant for as long as Homer wanted one, no matter how many mistakes he made, no matter how many times he should have been terminated, no matter how egregiously he failed at the basic requirements of his position, 742 documented errors. Homer was never permanently dismissed. Not because Burns had any affection for Homer, not because of some sentimental connection to the family his vendetta had destroyed, because the deal required it. The arrangement between his grandfather and his persecutor was the foundation of Homer's employment. Homer's job security, the one thing in his adult life that has remained stable and reliable, the anchor of the economic identity he's built around being a man who has a job and a house and a family, rests on a contract sealed in the secret corruption of a man who also destroyed his family. Homer is protected by the deal. Homer is also imprisoned by it. The man whose silence ensures Homer will always have work is the same man who ensured Homer would grow up without his mother. The protection and the wound have the same source. And Homer doesn't know. He can't know. And even if someone told him, the capacity to fully process what it means, the full, systemic, three-generational weight of what Burns did to the Simpson family may simply be beyond what his damaged cognition can hold. 3 generations of Simpsons, shaped by one man's decision. Abe, who made a deal with the man responsible for his wife's exile and kept both the deal and the lie for the rest of his life. Mona, who spent 27 years as a fugitive for the crime of trying to prevent biological warfare in her community, and who returned to Springfield only to be driven away again and again until she died. Homer, who inherited the consequences of all of it, the maternal absence, the psychological damage, the cognitive impairment, the contractual obligation to a man he barely understands as a threat, and who works every day at the plant his mother tried to stop, for the man his mother tried to fight, producing the electricity that powers the house where the family he was almost denied gets to live. And Burns won. Burns continues to win. Because in the system Burns built, winning is the only possible outcome for a man with his resources and his history and his century of institutional control. Mona Simpson tried to break the system. She burned his weapons and she ran, and she kept running until the world finally caught up with her, and she died beside a son she barely knew, having given him the only thing she had left to give, the truth. The truth about who she was, the truth about what she'd done, the truth about why she went. It wasn't enough to fix anything. The system was too large and too old and too well defended. But she tried. And in a town where the default posture is acceptance, where the population has been carefully managed into a state of cognitive compliance, trying was itself an act of extraordinary courage. Homer chose to put the crayon back, but the choice was never really his. The choice was made for him before he was old enough to know there was a choice to make, by a man who needed Homer small and compliant and unable to see the shape of his own life clearly enough to resist it. The smartest version of Homer Simpson exists. The show proved it. He emerged briefly when the crayon was removed, articulate, aware, capable of understanding the world with a clarity that made him temporarily unrecognizable. That Homer looked at Springfield and understood what he was seeing. That Homer looked at the plant and understood what it was. That Homer looked at his employer and saw something he had never seen before. And then he put the crayon back, because understanding was too painful and the fog was safer. Burns didn't just take Homer's mother. He took the Homer that Homer should have been. And that Homer, the complete one, the capable one, the one who could have seen through the system and asked the questions that would have made Burns uncomfortable, he's still in there. Behind the crayon. Behind the radiation. Behind 36 years of managed diminishment, that Homer has never had a chance. And in Springfield, there's no mechanism to give him one. The show ends every episode with the family on the couch. Warm, intact, together. Homer in the middle, his arm around Marge, the kids beside them. The television on, the house lit, everything as it should be. And somewhere in the room, without being able to name it, Homer carries the weight of everything that was taken. Not understanding it. Not able to articulate it. Just feeling it. The way you feel a room where something has been removed, a sense of absence you can't quite locate, because the missing thing was taken before you knew what it was. The family is still there. The love is real. But the full life, the life Homer might have lived if the plant didn't leak, and the crayon wasn't there, and the billionaire hadn't made the call that life is elsewhere, locked away, in a world where Mona came home. End of Section 7. Section 8. The Principal Who Wasn't Springfield's Choice to Forget. The episode is called The Principal and the Pauper. It aired on the 28th of September 1997. It is the second episode of Season 9, and it is, according to the show's own fan base, one of the worst episodes in the history of The Simpsons, an episode so reviled, so widely cited as the moment the show broke faith with its audience, that it has been invoked in discussions about the series' decline for nearly 3 decades. Harry Shearer, who voices Principal Skinner among dozens of other characters, stated publicly that he hated the episode and what it did to his character. Critics ranked it near the bottom of every retrospective assessment of the show's output. Fan forums have discussed it so extensively and with so much consistent negativity that it has achieved a kind of anti-legendary status. It is the episode everyone agrees was a mistake. And yet, when you step back from the emotional response, when you stop reacting to what the episode did to Skinner's character and start paying attention to what the episode actually showed you about Springfield, something changes. The revulsion subsides and something more interesting takes its place. Because the episode that fans call the worst in the series may be, in a very specific and important sense, the most honest episode the show has ever produced. It is the only episode that shows you how Springfield works. Not what Springfield does, but the mechanism, the actual machinery of the town's reality maintenance. Exposed, running in plain sight. For anyone willing to look at it without flinching, here's what happens. Springfield Elementary holds a ceremony honoring Principal Seymour Skinner's 20 years of service to the school. The event is cheerful and well attended. Skinner is moved. The community appreciates him. Everything is warm. Then a stranger enters the room. A man nobody recognizes. He introduces himself as Sergeant Seymour Skinner, the real Seymour Skinner, a decorated Vietnam War veteran who was captured as a prisoner of war in Southeast Asia. He was believed dead. He survived. He escaped. And he came home to find someone else living his life. The man Springfield has known as Principal Skinner for 20 years is an imposter. His real name is Armin Tamzarian. Before Vietnam, Tamzarian was a street-level petty criminal from nowhere in particular, a young man with no future and no identity worth protecting. He was drafted, served in the same unit as the actual Skinner, and when Skinner was captured and presumed killed, Tamzarian felt something that functioned like guilt. He traveled to Springfield to deliver the news of Skinner's death to Skinner's mother, Agnes. Agnes assumed he was her son. She needed him to be her son. She had just been told her son was dead, and here was someone who had known him, who carried something of him, who was present in the moment of grief and didn't correct her assumption. And Tamzarian, who had never been wanted by anyone, who had never had a family or a home or a name that meant anything to anyone, simply went along with it. He became Seymour Skinner. He wore the name and the rank and the life. He became the principal of the school. He became Agnes's son. He built an identity on the borrowed foundation of another man's existence. For 20 years. And then the real Skinner walked through the door. The town knows the truth now. It is fully exposed, fully documented, fully witnessed. The actual Seymour Skinner is standing in the room. Armin Tamzarian is standing in the room. Every person in Springfield who matters to the show's social world is present for the revelation. The imposter is unmasked. The real man is here. The lie is over. And then Springfield holds a meeting, not to discuss prosecution, not to determine how to make things right, not to address the question of what 20 years of lived fraud means legally or morally or socially. Springfield holds a meeting to decide whether to acknowledge the truth at all. And the vote is unanimous. They vote to keep the lie. Judge Snyder, a figure of legal authority within Springfield, issues a formal decree. The imposter is declared, by law, to be the real Skinner. The actual Seymour Skinner, the man who survived a prisoner of war camp and came home after 20 years to find his identity occupied, is physically removed from Springfield. He is tied to a train. He is expelled from the community. And the judge makes it explicitly illegal, under penalty of torture, to ever mention any of this again. Let that settle. A town collectively voted to sustain a known lie. They had definitive proof, standing in front of them, that a major public figure had been living a stolen identity for 2 decades. They had the actual person whose identity was stolen present in the same room. They chose the fake. They criminalized the truth. They exiled the man who represented the inconvenient reality and kept the man who represented the comfortable fiction. The fan backlash was about continuity, about the show retroactively undermining everything they knew about a beloved character, about Skinner's backstory, his relationship with his mother, his complicated dynamic with Bart, his Vietnam service, his entire personality being revealed as built on a lie, and how that revelation damaged the investment viewers had made in the character. These are legitimate feelings. The continuity damage is real. The character work that had accumulated over years was genuinely complicated by this revelation, but the backlash misses what the episode is actually doing. The episode is not making a statement about Skinner. It is making a statement about Springfield. And the statement is this: what you just watched Springfield do, vote to maintain a comfortable lie, exile the truth, criminalize memory, is not an aberration. It is how Springfield has always worked. The episode didn't show you something new. It showed you the mechanism of something you'd been watching for years without recognizing it. Every time Springfield forgets a catastrophe that should have permanently altered the town's reality, and the number of such catastrophes is staggering, encompassing disasters ranging from nuclear near misses to environmental contamination to the literal blocking of the sun, the forgetting has always been this: a collective choice, an unspoken vote to maintain the agreed-upon version of reality over the true version, a social contract that says, we will not acknowledge what happened. We will treat the fiction as the fact, and anyone who insists on the truth will find themselves, one way or another, tied to a train. The Principal and the Pauper is the only episode that shows you this process in real time, explicitly, with a visible vote and a legal decree. Every other time the reset happens, it happens off-screen, overnight, between episodes. Springfield wakes up the next week with no memory of what happened, and the audience has been trained to accept this as the show's episodic structure rather than as evidence of something. This episode lets you watch the mechanism operate. It shows you the meeting. It shows you the vote. It shows you the legal apparatus that enshrines the lie and the physical mechanism that removes the truth. It is the most transparent thing the show has ever done, and it was received as a betrayal because audiences were expecting continuity and got instead a lesson. The lesson? Springfield's amnesia is a choice. Every reset, every forgotten catastrophe, every return to baseline mourning after a world-ending event is the result of a decision that the community makes, collectively and implicitly, to sustain the version of itself that is easier to inhabit. They choose it not because they're stupid, although the radiation theory would suggest their capacity for this kind of reasoning has been compromised, but because the alternative, which is remembering and reckoning and changing, is more costly than the fiction. Consider the chain of consequences if Springfield were to actually remember. If they remembered the glass dome, they would have to acknowledge the contamination. If they acknowledged the contamination, they would have to confront the plant. If they confronted the plant, they would have to challenge Burns. If they challenged Burns, the economic foundation of the town would crack: the jobs, the electricity, the tax base, the institutional infrastructure that depends on his wealth and his political influence. If the economic foundation cracked, the town would face a version of itself it has never been asked to handle: a Springfield without Burns, which is also a Springfield without most of the things that make it function. So they forget. They vote to forget. They make forgetting into law. And anyone who refuses to forget, anyone who keeps insisting on the reality of what happened over the consensus version of what happened, gets exiled, gets tied to a train, gets removed from the community because the community cannot hold them and also hold its version of itself at the same time. The real Seymour Skinner was Springfield's experiment with honesty. He arrived carrying proof that the official narrative was false. He didn't arrive angry. He wasn't attempting revenge. He was simply the truth, walking into a room that had organized itself around the assumption of its own absence. And the room's response, unanimous, immediate, legally formalized, was to remove the truth from the premises. That's not a punchline. That's the show's thesis about how communities function when the truth they're asked to hold conflicts with the identity they've built. Small towns, in particular communities with strong collective self-images and long institutional memories, develop remarkable mechanisms for excluding uncomfortable realities. Crimes get buried. Histories get rewritten. The official version becomes so embedded in the community's sense of itself that challenging it feels less like correcting a factual error and more like attacking the community's existence. Springfield is not unique in this. Springfield is the exaggerated version of something that happens everywhere. The show just had the honesty to show you the vote. If the coma theory is true, if everything since season 4 is Homer's dream, then this episode takes on a different resonance. Homer's unconscious mind, building a world from the raw material of his memories and his desires, invented a scenario in which an entire community votes to sustain a lie, because that's what Homer needs to believe is possible. He needs to believe that fictions can be maintained through collective agreement. He needs to believe that a stolen identity can become real if enough people decide it's real. He needs to believe that the fake version of a life can be accepted as legitimate by the world around it. Because that's what Homer's coma is. A fake life replacing a real one. A dream standing in for consciousness. A version of Springfield and his family and his house and his existence that is generated by his mind rather than lived in the world, sustained by his own cognitive resources and the hope that nobody will notice. If Springfield votes to maintain Tamzarian's fiction, then Homer's dreaming mind can believe that its own fiction is similarly sustainable, that the world can agree collectively to let the dream be real, that he doesn't have to wake up and face the years that have passed. The Principal and the Pauper is not the worst episode of The Simpsons. When you understand what it's doing, what it's actually arguing about Springfield, and about the nature of communities, and about the relationship between truth and comfort in places that can't afford both, it becomes something closer to the most important episode. Not the most entertaining, not the most beloved. The most important, because it is the only one that holds the mirror directly to the mechanism and refuses to look away. The real Seymour Skinner is still out there, presumably. Somewhere down the train line, with his real name and his real history and his real war record, in a world that declared his existence illegal and removed him from it. The last honest man in a town that made honesty a crime. Armin Tamzarian continues to be Principal Skinner. Springfield continues to be Springfield. And the machinery that produced that outcome continues to operate silently between episodes, resetting the town to its preferred version of itself every week. We just rarely get to watch it work. End of Section 8. Section 9. The predictions how Springfield sees the future. Let's talk about the predictions. Because no accounting of Springfield's mysteries is complete without addressing the phenomenon that has made The Simpsons more famous in the 2020s than it was at the height of its cultural power 30 years ago. The idea that a cartoon sitcom that premiered in 1989 has been accurately forecasting world events with a precision and specificity that defies statistical explanation. You've seen the clips. You've seen the screenshots. The Simpsons did it first as a refrain that has become as associated with the show as any of its actual catchphrases. And the scope of what the show is said to have predicted is genuinely staggering in its breadth. In the year 2000, episode Bart to the Future depicted a future in which Lisa Simpson serves as the first female president of the United States. In that same episode, her predecessor in the Oval Office is identified as Donald Trump. The episode aired 16 years before the 2016 election. 16 years before Trump's actual presidency materialized? The show presented it as a punchline, as the inevitable absurd endpoint of American celebrity culture's increasing contamination of democratic politics. And then America, 16 years later, arrived at exactly that endpoint. That specific prediction made The Simpsons an internet phenomenon in ways that transcended its existing fan base. People who hadn't watched the show in years, people who had never watched it, were sharing screenshots and asking, how did they know? The list extends considerably from there. In 1995, the show depicted a device worn on the wrist that functions in ways now recognizable as a smartwatch. In 1994, Homer goes to space aboard a shuttle with Buzz Aldrin, decades before commercial space tourism became a reality for wealthy civilians. In 1998, Homer worked through a mathematical equation on a chalkboard, a visual throwaway gag in the background of a scene that appears, when analyzed by actual mathematicians decades later, to anticipate the mass of the Higgs boson particle, which wasn't experimentally confirmed until 2012. In 1999, Homer proposed a theory about the shape of the universe as a donut, a torus. Years later, analysis of cosmic microwave background radiation produced patterns that some cosmologists interpret as consistent with a toroidal universe. The show made the joke. The universe may have subsequently agreed. In 1993, an episode called Marge in Chains depicted a flu virus originating in Asia, spreading to Springfield, causing panic buying, supply chain disruptions, and a desperate search for a cure. The episode aired 27 years before the COVID-19 pandemic. During the show's fictional outbreak, the townsfolk accidentally released a swarm of bees, which felt oddly resonant when Asian giant hornets were discovered in the United States in 2020 during the actual pandemic, and were immediately dubbed murder hornets by media outlets. In 1996, the Homerpalooza episode featured a gag in which the hip-hop group Cypress Hill accidentally books the London Symphony Orchestra. That exact collaboration, not a version of it, not something thematically similar, but Cypress Hill literally performing with the London Symphony Orchestra in a formal concert setting happened in 2024 at the Royal Albert Hall. 28 years between the joke and the event. In 1998, the show depicted a media merger that resulted in the 20th Century Fox brand being absorbed by a larger entertainment corporation. In 2019, Disney completed its acquisition of 21st Century Fox. The Simpsons had been a Fox property the entire time. The show predicted the sale of the company that owned it. Across multiple episodes scattered through the late 1990s and early 2000s, the show depicted video calling technology, autocorrect failures in text communication, surveillance culture, and technologies that at the time of broadcast were speculative, and which are now so embedded in daily life that it's strange to remember they were once imaginary. And every time a new one surfaces, every time someone digs up an old episode and finds a plot point, or a background detail, or a throwaway gag that appears to map onto something that actually happened, the internet cycles through the same response. Astonishment, the sense that something impossible has occurred. The question, how do they keep doing this? The answer from inside the show is less mysterious than the question implies, and it's worth hearing clearly before we get to the part that remains genuinely interesting. Al Jean, who has been an executive producer on The Simpsons since its earliest seasons, addressed the prediction phenomenon directly. His answer was blunt. If you throw enough darts, you're going to hit some bullseyes. That's not dismissiveness. That's mathematics. The Simpsons has produced nearly 800 episodes across 36 years. Each episode contains dozens of jokes, satirical observations, cultural references, and projections about the direction American society and technology are heading. When you generate that volume of content over that time span, some percentage of it is going to align with future events through sheer probability. Bill Oakley, who ran the show during several of its most celebrated seasons, put it this way: there are very few cases where The Simpsons genuinely predicted something. Most of it is coincidence, because the episodes are old enough that history has had time to catch up and repeat itself. Fact-checking organizations have examined the most prominent prediction claims systematically and found that a significant number of them are more complicated than the viral presentation suggests. Many are based on trends that were already visible when the episodes were written. The Trump presidency prediction from 2000 wasn't a bolt of foresight into an unimaginable future. Trump had been publicly floating the idea of a presidential run since the late 1980s. He was a fixture of tabloid culture and political commentary. The Simpsons writers looked at where the trend of celebrity politics and reality television were heading and wrote a joke about the logical extreme. They extrapolated a trajectory that was already in motion. The Disney-Fox merger wasn't a supernatural insight. Media consolidation was an accelerating and widely discussed trend throughout the 1990s. The writers looked at the trajectory, picked one of the largest companies in the entertainment industry as the likely acquirer, and wrote a gag. The merger they depicted was different in specifics from the one that actually happened, and the timeline was off by decades. But the general shape was predictable by anyone paying close attention to the industry. The smartwatch observation was technology getting smaller and more personal and more integrated into daily life, a trend that was visible in the mid-1990s and that any thoughtful person paying attention to the consumer electronics industry could have extrapolated forward. The Simpsons writing staff has historically been one of the most educated in television. Multiple writers hold degrees from Harvard, Yale, and other elite research institutions. Many have academic backgrounds in mathematics, science, economics, and political theory. These are not random guesses. These are intelligent, educated, culturally attentive people spending their careers studying how things work and projecting those workings forward into satirical territory. They read the present carefully. They push it forward. When the future eventually catches up to where the satire was pointed, it looks like prophecy. It isn't prophecy. It's good analysis delivered early. The confirmation bias factor cannot be overstated. The Simpsons has also produced hundreds of predictions that never materialized. Jokes about jetpacks, humor about political outcomes that went the other direction, gags about technological developments that never happened. Cultural shifts the show anticipated that society declined to make. Nobody screenshots those. Nobody builds viral threads around the Simpsons bits that turned out to be wrong. The internet, by its nature, filters for hits and buries misses. And when you run that filter across 800 episodes of content, the highlight reel that remains looks like a remarkably accurate crystal ball. It's the same principle that allows any sufficiently large collection of predictions to look prophetic in retrospect. You remember the accurate ones and forget the inaccurate ones, and the ratio of what you remember to what actually happened is so distorted that the result reads as supernatural. All of this is the honest, demystified explanation of the prediction phenomenon, and it accounts for the majority of the examples, but not all of them. Some of the coincidences carry a specificity that makes probability feel strained as an explanation. The Trump prediction specified him by name and depicted him descending an escalator, a detail that visually mirrors the actual announcement Trump made in 2015 when descending an escalator in Trump Tower. That's not just getting the general shape right. That's a specific staging detail appearing in a satirical depiction 16 years before the event. The Siegfried and Roy episode didn't just make a joke about exotic animal acts being dangerous. It depicted a white tiger attacking one of the performers in a context specific enough that when Roy Horn was critically injured by one of the act's white tigers in 2003, the episode resurfaced immediately as an apparent prediction of the exact incident. These are the examples that sit in the uncomfortable space between coincidence and something else. Not supernatural, not impossible, but specific enough that purely statistical explanations start to feel incomplete. This is where the meta-theory becomes interesting. Not the theory that the show predicts the future, that framing is too simple and too mystical. The more sophisticated version, the show shapes the future, not through prophecy, through cultural influence operating at a scale so large and sustained that it actually affects what happens. The Simpsons is one of the most widely watched, most deeply embedded pieces of American media in history. Its jokes have become part of the language. Its observations have become part of how Americans understand themselves and their country. When the show makes a joke about Trump becoming president, and that joke enters the cultural bloodstream and is seen by millions of people and becomes a reference point that people carry into political conversations and share on social media, and think about when they see Trump's face on the news, the joke doesn't predict the future. The joke makes the future feel familiar before it arrives. It primes the cultural imagination. It establishes the mental category. It makes Trump as president feel less like a shocking rupture and more like an inevitable punchline that the world is finally delivering. When reality catches up to the joke, the audience doesn't experience surprise. They experience recognition. We've seen this before. The Simpsons already told us this would happen. The sense of prophecy isn't the show predicting the event. It's the show having installed the frame through which the event is experienced. The show didn't predict the Disney-Fox merger. It made media consolidation feel obvious and inevitable by depicting it as satire. When the merger actually happened, the cultural response wasn't shock, it was the sense of a punchline landing. Of course, The Simpsons already did this. The predictions aren't forecasts, they're frames. And when reality catches up to a frame that millions of people have been carrying in their heads for 15 or 20 years, The collision feels like prophecy because the frame was already there, already waiting, already shaping how the event would be perceived. Springfield doesn't predict America. Springfield shapes how America understands itself. And America, after 36 years of looking in that particular mirror, has started to look like what it saw. The nuclear plant on the horizon, the corrupt billionaire, the incompetent safety apparatus, the population too distracted and too impaired to notice how thoroughly they're being managed. The endless cycle of catastrophe and reset and catastrophe again. The show didn't invent these things. It observed them, named them, and reflected them back with such clarity and such humor and such longevity that the observations became the framework through which we perceive the reality. Springfield isn't a prediction of where America was heading. Springfield is a diagnosis of where America already was. The show just had the clarity to write it down. And here's the final, genuinely unsettling piece. The show has made thousands of observations that haven't come true, thousands of projections that missed, hundreds of satirical extrapolations that the world declined to enact. None of those generate viral threads or documentary segments or breathless articles about the show's prophetic powers. We keep only the hits, we bury the misses, and the highlight reel we've assembled from 36 years of content, filtered through the confirmation bias of a culture that loves the idea of hidden knowledge, looks like something it isn't. But even knowing exactly how the trick works, understanding the mathematics and the filter and the cultural priming the specific ones, still land. The escalator, the white tiger, the merger, the mass of a subatomic particle scribbled in the background of an animated scene, turning out to be close to the right number. Those still make you pause. They still make you look at the writers and wonder if they knew something. If something about the act of sustained, careful, intelligent observation of American culture for long enough eventually starts to tip over into something that resembles actual foresight, the show's own creators have, at moments, allowed themselves to wonder this. The math says it's coincidence. The best of the examples make the math feel inadequate, and Springfield keeps going. It keeps making observations. It keeps pushing trajectories forward into their logical extremes. It keeps putting things on screen that feel ridiculous when they air and recognizable 5 or 15 or 28 years later. Maybe the writers are just very good at reading the present. Maybe that's all this ever was. Or maybe Springfield, sitting outside of time, floating between states, populated by people who don't age and events that don't stick, has some peculiar relationship with the sequence of cause and effect that the rest of us experience as time. Maybe a town where nothing changes understands the nature of change in ways that fixed, aging, consequential places cannot. Maybe the fish has 3 eyes because it sees things from a different angle than the fish with 2. End of Section 9. Section 10. Where is Springfield? The town. With no address. You cannot find Springfield on a map. Not because the map is wrong. Because Springfield is not the kind of place that appears on maps. This sounds like it should be a simple problem with a simple answer. The show has a creator. The creator has a history. The name Springfield comes from somewhere. And in fact, Matt Groening has confirmed it in a 2012 interview with Smithsonian Magazine. He named the town after Springfield, Oregon, the town nearest to Portland where he grew up. He chose the name because Springfield is one of the most common city names in America. There are Springfields in 34 states. And because the ubiquity of the name allowed the town to feel like it could be anywhere. For approximately 48 hours after that interview, the mystery appeared to be solved. Springfield was in Oregon. Case closed. And then the show continued contradicting this, exactly as it had been contradicting every previous geographic clue for the preceding 23 years. Episodes aired after the Smithsonian interview that placed Springfield in geographic contexts inconsistent with Oregon. The writers didn't honor Groening's confession. The mystery remained alive. Because the mystery was never really about which state Springfield was in. The mystery, the deeper, more interesting one, was why the show had spent 36 years making it impossible to answer, and what that impossibility served. The geographic contradictions in The Simpsons are not accidental. They are not the result of continuity errors or lazy writing or different writers having different assumptions about where the show is set. They are the result of a sustained, deliberate effort to ensure that no single piece of geographic information can be assembled with any other piece into a definitive location. Springfield, as the show depicts it, borders Ohio, Nevada, Maine, and Kentucky depending on the episode. It is located on the coast. It is also located in the heartland. It is near the Canadian border. It is also near Mexico. It has mountains. It has deserts. It has tropical weather and blizzards and farmland and harborfront. It has a gorge that appears to be the size of the Grand Canyon, and a beach that appears to be in New England, and a landscape that changes with each establishing shot based on whatever the story requires. No actual American state contains all of these things. No actual American geography supports a community with mountains, ocean, desert, and farmland within easy driving distance of each other. Springfield is not located in America. Springfield is assembled from America. It is a compression, a Frankenstein construction built from geographic pieces of every American community the writers wanted to reference, stitched together without regard for actual spatial relationships, because actual spatial relationships were never the point. The stated intention is familiar and legitimate. Springfield is meant to feel like every American town, so that every American viewer can recognize it as theirs, regardless of where they're actually from. The industrial decay feels like the Rust Belt. The suburban sprawl feels like the Sun Belt. The small-town insularity feels like New England. The flat cultural blankness feels like the Midwest. There's something in the geography, whatever direction it's pointing in any given episode, that lands for someone watching it. This is the surface explanation, and it's true as far as it goes. But the theories we've been working through tonight suggest something darker underneath the surface. If the radiation theory is correct, if the plant's contamination has been altering the physics of Springfield's residents for decades, there's no particular reason why the contamination should be limited to biology. The same force that has given the fish 3 eyes and the humans 4 fingers and the billionaire a century-plus lifespan might also be doing something to the space around the town. Warping the geography. Compressing distances that should be impossible to compress. Folding mountains and oceans into each other in ways that defy what we understand about physical space. If the contamination has broken the rules of biology, why should geography be exempt from the same effect? It's speculative. But within the logic of a show where the rules have been demonstrably broken at the biological level, it's not an unreasonable extension. The coma theory has a more emotionally direct answer. If Springfield exists inside Homer's dreaming mind, if the entire world of the show is a construct generated by an unconscious man's memories and longings, then its geography follows the logic of dreams rather than the logic of maps. Dreams don't have consistent spatial relationships. Dreams place things where they feel right rather than where they are. Homer's memory of America is assembled from every vacation, every road trip, every movie, every television commercial he ever absorbed in his waking life. Mountains from a trip somewhere, oceans from something he saw once, desert from a film, farmland from driving. The dream city is built from all of these fragments, layered on top of each other without geographic coherence, because dreams don't require geographic coherence. They require emotional coherence. They need to feel right. And Springfield feels right to Homer because it's made from everything Homer ever loved about the world. The principle and the pauper theory, the argument that Springfield operates through collective choice to maintain convenient fictions, offers perhaps the most politically interesting reading of the geographic mystery. You cannot investigate a town you cannot find. You cannot bring federal regulatory action against a nuclear facility if you cannot establish which state's regulatory authority governs it. You cannot hold anyone accountable for contaminating a community's water supply if the community's jurisdiction keeps shifting between episodes. You cannot file charges. You cannot summons. You cannot audit. You cannot inspect with the authority of any specific state's law if the state keeps changing. Springfield floats between jurisdictions because floating is safer than landing. Landing means accountability. Landing means the EPA knows which region's office to contact. Landing means a specific state attorney general has clear authority to investigate the three-eyed fish and the cracked cooling towers and the human skeletons in the basement. Landing means someone shows up with a badge and a map and the legal standing to demand answers. A town with no fixed address has no fixed regulatory oversight. The ambiguity of Springfield's location is a legal shield, maintaining a state of jurisdictional uncertainty that ensures no single authority can ever definitively claim responsibility for what happens inside it. The violations continue. The contamination continues. The billionaire continues his operations, and no one can be held accountable because no one can agree on who would do the holding. Behind the Laughter, the Season 12 mockumentary episode that presents The Simpsons as a real family who were turned into a TV show provides what is, on one level, the most definitive geographic answer the show has ever given. In the original broadcast, Springfield is identified as being in northern Kentucky, a specific, definitive answer, a location. In syndicated reruns, the location was changed to a different state. The show gave you the answer and then changed the answer between broadcasts. Even when Springfield has a fixed address, the address is unstable. It mutates. It refuses to hold still. The answer you heard on the original broadcast is not the answer you'll hear if you catch the episode in reruns. The truth of Springfield's location depends on when you watched and where you watched, which means the truth is not a truth at all, but a variable one that shifts based on the conditions of observation. This is, when you sit with it, either a fascinating piece of creative work or a deeply disturbing one. The show built a town that cannot be located with any certainty and ensured that even the attempts at definition are themselves contradicted and revised. It's a community that exists in a permanent state of geographic quantum superposition simultaneously everywhere and nowhere, found and not found, until the moment of observation, at which point it obligingly becomes somewhere specific and then immediately changes its mind. Every state has been theorized as Springfield's home. Every theory has evidence. Every theory has contradicting evidence. The show has maintained this productive ambiguity for longer than most of its current audience has been alive, and it will keep maintaining it. Springfield will never be located, not because the show can't decide, but because the show decided long ago that Springfield is more valuable as a mystery than as an answer. A town that could be anywhere is a town that belongs to everyone. A town that belongs to everyone is a town that no one can shut down, regulate, investigate, or hold accountable. A town that keeps moving is a town that can't be caught. That's not an accident. In Springfield, very little is. End of Section 10. Section 11. The floating timeline: why nobody ages. We have arrived at the question that everything else in this video has been building toward. The one that sits at the center of every theory, connects every mystery, and has the most answers but also the least satisfying resolution. Why doesn't anyone age in Springfield? The facts are simple and they are strange. Bart Simpson was 10 years old when the show began in December of 1989. He is 10 years old right now. Lisa was 8. She is still 8. Maggie was 1. She remains 1. Homer and Marge were in their mid-30s. They still are. The characters who populated Springfield's background in the first season, Barney, Principal Skinner, Ned Flanders, Chief Wiggum, Apu, are the same age they were then. Nobody has aged a day. Nobody has added a birthday. The calendar has continued turning in the real world for 36 years, and in Springfield, nothing has moved. The production term for this is a floating timeline, and we've touched on it already in the context of other discussions. But now it deserves its own examination, because the floating timeline is not just a stylistic choice or a narrative convention. It is the most fundamental thing about what Springfield is, and it connects to every theory and every mystery and every pattern we've been tracking. Start with what the floating timeline actually does to the show's logic. Homer and Marge have a fixed backstory. They met in high school, fell in love, had Bart before they were quite ready for him, built a life. When the show began, that backstory was grounded in the late 1970s and early 1980s. The music they fell in love to, the fashion of their high school years, the cultural references of their youth, all of it placed their formative period in a specific and recognizable era. But the floating timeline moved the present forward while keeping the characters the same age. If Homer and Marge are still in their mid-30s in 2025, they didn't meet in 1977. They met around 2005, which means their high school years were defined not by Watergate and disco, but by social media and the early internet. The show has tracked this shift, retelling their origin story multiple times, placing their youth in different decades with each retelling. They've been hippies, grunge fans, hipsters, and millennials across different flashback episodes. Same love story, same marriage, same family, different past. Their history is a draft that keeps getting revised. Their memories are not stable. Their origin is whatever the current episode requires it to be. This is the floating timeline's most visible effect on character integrity, and it's the thing that makes longtime viewers most uncomfortable. The sense that the show is rewriting its own history without acknowledgement, continuously, in order to maintain the fiction that the present is always right now. Now run all of the theories through this fact. The radiation theory says nobody ages because the contamination has disrupted the biological mechanisms that produce aging. At the cellular level, the mutation is total enough that the normal progression of time through a biological body has been altered. The characters are not frozen by narrative convenience. They are frozen by what the plant has done to their cells. The same process that gave Homer 4 fingers and a 3-eyed fish has also, at a deeper level, changed the fundamental biological clock in every person who lives and drinks and breathes in Springfield's environment. The coma theory says nobody ages because they exist inside the frozen mind of an unconscious man. Homer's dreaming brain cannot generate aged versions of his family because it has no reference data for what they look like older. It can only render what it knew. Bart at 10, Lisa at 8. Marge the way she looked on the last day Homer was conscious. The characters are preserved in amber, not by biology but by epistemology. They are as old as Homer's last clear memory of them. No older, no less, because the dream cannot manufacture what the dreamer never saw. The collective denial theory, built on the principle and the pauper argument, says the characters don't age because Springfield has decided they won't. Time passing is a truth. Springfield exiles truths that are inconvenient. Aging is inconvenient. It means acknowledging the passage of time, the accumulation of consequence, the approach of mortality. Springfield votes, implicitly and constantly, to not acknowledge these things. And in a town where the vote is unanimous and the truth has been made illegal, the characters stay the same age because the community has collectively chosen to not notice otherwise. The Burns immortality theory adds something strange to the equation. Burns has, through the application of extreme wealth and experimental medicine, extended his own lifespan so far beyond the normal human range that the concept of aging has become, for him, negotiable. He has demonstrated, in his own person, that aging is not inevitable, that it can be managed, countered, worked around by someone with sufficient resources and sufficient motivation. If aging is negotiable for one person in Springfield, it establishes a precedent. It means the town exists in a universe where the normal rules of time are already suspended for at least one resident. And the prediction theory, the argument about the show's relationship with American culture, suggests something more abstract. The Simpsons has spent 36 years functioning as a mirror for American society. And American society, as reflected in that mirror, does not age gracefully. It cycles. It returns to the same positions, the same conflicts, the same mistakes, with a regularity that feels less like progress and more like a loop. The show and the culture have created a feedback relationship in which the culture's patterns are reflected in the show and the show's patterns are absorbed back into the culture, producing a cycle that has been running so long that the distinction between what the show depicts and what the culture does has become genuinely hard to identify. In that relationship, the show can't age because the culture it's reflecting isn't aging either. It's cycling. The same conversations, the same crises, the same resolutions that don't resolve. The Springfield loop and the American loop are running in parallel, both stuck, both refusing the change that would require genuine reckoning with what they are. Every theory arrives at the same place through a different path. Time doesn't work in Springfield. Something has broken the normal progression, whether it's radiation or coma-generated dream logic or community-enforced denial or the precedent set by a billionaire who has been cheating death for over a century. Time is suspended, the characters are frozen, and the show, after 36 years, has no plan to change this. The show has imagined its characters aging, multiple times. Lisa's wedding, in Season 6, flashed forward to show Lisa at 23, engaged to be married, already the complicated and searching person the show had always suggested she'd become. The episode was beautiful, specific, emotionally true. It proved that The Simpsons could tell aging stories, that it could imagine its characters as adults with histories and futures, and the particular sadness of people who have grown up without quite becoming who they wanted to be. And then it returned Lisa to 8 years old. The flash forward closed, the window shut. The future was locked away and the permanent present resumed as if the glimpse had never happened. The show can imagine growth. It has chosen not to allow it. This is, when you sit with it, the most honest thing The Simpsons has ever done. Because the show's refusal to let its characters age is not just a production decision or a narrative convenience. It's a statement. The most important statement the show has made across 36 years of television. The Simpsons are not just a family. They are the American family. They have been the American family for longer than any other fictional household in the history of the medium. And the American family, as The Simpsons depicts it, is not allowed to change. Homer must always be middle-aged and lovably flawed. Marge must always be patient and slightly compromised in her patience. Bart must always be rebellious in ways that are charming rather than genuinely threatening. Lisa must always be idealistic and lonely and right about everything in ways that prevent her from being happy. Maggie must always be silent and small and watching. The structure must hold. The family dynamic must be preserved. Because the moment the Simpson family actually ages, the moment Bart goes to college and develops a life beyond his father's shadow, the moment Lisa moves to a city that can actually hold her, the moment Maggie finally speaks and reveals what she's been thinking all this time, the moment Homer retires and Marge is left in the house on Evergreen Terrace, in the specific quiet that follows 30 years of sustained chaos, it stops being a comedy. It becomes an elegy. It becomes the story of a family that ran out of time, that used up its years. That reached the point that every family eventually reaches, where the children are gone and the parents are old and the house that was once full of noise is full of a different kind of presence. America doesn't want that story. Or rather, America wants that story, but not from The Simpsons. From The Simpsons, America wants something specific. The family that doesn't end. The couch that's always occupied. The Sunday night at 8 that always delivers the same warm familiarity regardless of what's happened during the week. The show that runs and runs and runs and never reaches the episode where Bart is 11. The floating timeline is not the show's compromise with narrative reality. It's the show's core purpose. The Simpsons are frozen in time because we need them frozen. Because they represent something that we cannot afford to lose to the normal passage of time. The messy, costly, ongoing American family with its dysfunction and its love and its remarkable capacity for surviving everything thrown at it and returning to the couch by the end of the episode. If the coma theory is true, if Homer has been dreaming since 1993, then the floating timeline has its most tender explanation. The dream preserves what Homer loves at the moment he loved it most. His children will never grow up in the dream because Homer isn't there to watch them grow. His wife will never change because the dream can only work with the last image Homer has of her. The family is frozen in amber because amber is what love does, when it has no future, only a past that it refuses to release. That's the loop, Homer's loop, Springfield's loop, the show's loop, America's loop. We built it. We maintain it. Every Sunday night when we tune in, every time we press play on an episode we've seen 100 times, every time we laugh at the same gag we laughed at in 1993 or 2003 or last week, we tighten the loop a little more. We make it a little harder for the family to grow. We choose the amber over the change, the preservation over the loss, the dream over the waking. Because if the Simpsons age, if the timeline stops floating, if Bart turns 11 and Lisa turns 9 and the couch gets a different occupant, then the show ends. And the ending means something we're not ready to admit. That the version of America it represents the chaotic, loving, endlessly resilient, never quite right version of the middle-class American family was always temporary, was always fragile, was always one birthday away from becoming something unrecognizable. Time stopped in Springfield because we stopped it. We pressed pause in 1989. We've never pressed play. And here we are, 36 years later, watching the same family in the same house, waiting for something to change, knowing with quiet certainty that nothing will, because we won't let it. End of Section 11. Section 12. Hans Moleman, Ned Flanders, and the ones the system broke. We are almost at the end. And before we close, there are two characters who deserve attention precisely because they have received so little of it. They exist at the edges of the show's main cast, recurring figures who drift through Springfield's background without ever receiving the kind of sustained examination that the family at the center commands. But both of them, when you look at them through the lenses we've developed over the course of this evening, become something more than background players. One of them may be the most frequently killed character in the history of animation. The other may be the saddest person in the entire show. And together they complete the picture of Springfield that we've been building since the first section. Not the funny picture. The real one. Let's start with Hans Moleman. If you've watched The Simpsons for any length of time, you know him. He's the tiny, elderly, nearly blind man who materializes in Springfield's background scenes and exists primarily for the purpose of suffering. He gets hit by cars. He gets crushed by falling objects. He gets buried alive by municipal workers who fail to notice him before filling in a hole. He gets eaten by animals. He gets struck by lightning. He gets incinerated. He walks into traffic and disappears beneath the wheels of vehicles driven by people who don't see him until it's too late. He is, by the most conservative estimate anyone has attempted to make, the most frequently killed character in the history of American animation. Dozens of canonical deaths across regular episodes, not Treehouse of Horror specials, not dream sequences, not alternate universe storytelling, but main continuity canonical episodes where the show's events are meant to be taken as real within the fiction. Moleman dies, sometimes at the edge of the frame, sometimes in the foreground, sometimes in scenes where his death is incidental background detail, and sometimes in scenes where his dying is the joke. And then he appears in the next episode, completely intact. No explanation, no resurrection arc. No acknowledgement that he was dead 2 episodes ago. He simply shows up, ready to be killed again, in a cycle of death and return that the show has been running for 3 decades without ever pausing to examine. Most viewers categorize this as a running gag and move on. Moleman dies a lot. It's the bit. Don't think about it. But through the frameworks we've developed, Moleman's repeated deaths are something considerably more interesting. If the radiation theory is true, if Springfield's contaminated environment produces biological mutations, and if those mutations manifest differently across different individuals in ways ranging from Homer's cognitive impairment to Maggie's apparent cognitive enhancement, then Moleman may represent the extreme end of a different axis of mutation entirely. Not intelligence, but biological resilience. Not the brain, but the body's relationship with death itself. Consider, Moleman doesn't survive his deaths the way Homer survives injuries. Homer absorbs damage and recovers. He doesn't die. He gets hurt and heals. Moleman actually dies. His biological functions cease. And then they resume, without explanation, without medical intervention, without any mechanism the show acknowledges. What if this is not a gag? What if this is the radiation theory's most extreme data point? If chronic radiation exposure can, in some individuals, alter the cellular mechanisms of aging and biological progression, if it can, as we've argued in Homer's case, affect the rate and nature of biological change, then, in a specific individual with a specific biological response, it might produce something more radical, a cellular reconstitution ability, a biological reset triggered by whatever the plant's contamination has done to his cellular structure, not invulnerability. Not immunity to damage, but the capacity, somehow, for the body to rebuild itself after what should be a clear mental event. Death in Springfield is not, under this reading, a permanent condition for certain residents. It's a temporary one, a state that some bodies can exit. This is a monstrous and fascinating idea. It means that the most fundamental assumption of biological existence, that death is final, that the cessation of biological function is irreversible, does not apply universally in Springfield. For at least one resident, death is a revolving door, entered and exited repeatedly, without protocol, without drama, without acknowledgement from the community around him. And the community doesn't acknowledge it. That's the detail that completes the picture. Moleman dies repeatedly, visibly, in public, in front of witnesses who proceed with their scenes as if nothing notable has occurred. Nobody calls for an ambulance. Nobody investigates. Nobody asks how the man who was clearly dead last Tuesday is buying a newspaper today. The town has normalized Moleman's death cycle with the same thoroughness with which it has normalized everything else that should be alarming. He dies. He comes back. Springfield keeps going. Then there's the detail that the show drops so casually that it's easy to miss entirely. In one episode, Moleman states his age as 31. 31. He appears to be between 80 and 90 years old. His face is collapsed into the kind of structural gravity that comes with decades of aging. His eyes are effectively non-functional. His body is frail in a way that suggests decades of wear. He walks slowly, carefully, as if the ground itself represents a threat. By every visible measure, he is a very old man. He says he is 31. Either he is lying, which would be strange because there's no context in which the lie serves Molman any purpose, or he is telling the truth, which means something happened to him. Something took a man in the early prime of his life and collapsed him into an apparent geriatric state over a time span that no natural human aging process could explain. Something aged him catastrophically. Something worked on his biological clock at a rate far exceeding anything normal. And simultaneously, because these two facts exist together in the same person, something made him effectively impossible to kill. Extreme premature aging, effective biological immortality, both present in the same small, battered, nearly blind body. The radiation theory's answer is that both effects are products of the same contamination, expressed in extreme form in an individual whose biology responded to the exposure in a particularly distinctive way. His cellular aging was massively accelerated, while simultaneously his cellular reconstitution capacity was enhanced to the point where even fatal cellular failure could be reversed. Fast aging and death reversal, both products of the same environmental cause. The coma theory has a more abstract answer. Molmen is a background process in Homer's dream, a minor character that Homer's unconscious mind doesn't maintain with full consistency. He dies because the dream occasionally lets minor figures lapse. He reappears because the dream requires a certain population density in Springfield's background, and so the process restarts. He isn't a person in Homer's dream, he's furniture. Furniture that breaks and gets replaced with an identical copy that nobody notices isn't the same as the previous one. And the collective denial theory simply notes that Molman is one more thing Springfield has agreed not to examine. A man who dies regularly and returns regularly, and whom nobody investigates or questions, is simply another entry on the very long list of alarming things that Springfield has voted, implicitly and collectively, to not acknowledge. What makes Molman worth dwelling on is precisely that he is not a main character. He has no narrative arc. He has no story that the show is telling. He exists in the margins, in the background, in the space where the camera isn't directly pointed. And in those margins, the show has been quietly depicting something that, if it happened to a main character, would be the most discussed plotline in the show's history. A man who dies and returns, repeatedly, without explanation, in a town that doesn't notice. That's not a background gag. Under any of the frameworks we've been working with, that's evidence. Evidence of what the contamination can do to a body at its most extreme. Evidence of what Springfield ignores when the subject is inconvenient. Evidence of what a dreaming mind does with the minor players in the story it's trying to tell. Molman's deaths are the show's most consistent evidence that something is genuinely wrong in Springfield. They've been happening for 30 years, in plain sight, and almost nobody has stopped to look. Now Ned Flanders. Ned Flanders is everything Homer Simpson is not. Patient, generous, physically fit, financially responsible, devoutly religious, an attentive parent, a thoughtful neighbor. By any objective measure, and this point is important, a significantly better person than Homer in virtually every quantifiable respect. He is kind when kindness costs him something. He gives to people who take without gratitude. He forgives offenses that would permanently rupture most relationships. And the show punishes him for it, relentlessly, systematically, with a thoroughness that, when you inventory it, begins to feel less like the arbitrary cruelty of a random universe and more like a pattern. Ned's wife, Maud, was killed at the Springfield Speedway. A t-shirt cannon misfired. The shirts were aimed at Homer, who dodged them. They struck Maud instead. She fell. She died because Homer's reflex to protect himself redirected the projectiles toward a woman who had never done anything to deserve what happened to her. Homer's selfishness, not malice, not deliberate harm, just the reflexive and immediate instinct to protect himself before considering the people around him, killed Ned's wife. And Ned forgave him, because that's what Ned does. He turned the other cheek. He absorbed the loss. He maintained the grace that his faith required him to maintain, and he didn't destroy the relationship with his neighbor because his theological framework gave him a language for processing loss that didn't require assigning blame. The show takes this as characterization, Ned's forgiveness as a defining quality. his faith as the source of his capacity for grace under sustained and undeserved suffering. But a famous episode complicates this in a way the show never fully revisited. When a hurricane destroys Ned's house, the community's rebuilding effort is so incompetent and so structurally unsound that the new house collapses immediately. Something in Ned breaks. He has a complete psychological breakdown. He screams at the town. He inventories, systematically and with surprising accuracy, every slight, every ungratitude, every loss, every instance of being the better person in a world that rewards worse behavior. He says things that have been building in him for years, maybe decades, and the act of saying them is so foreign to everything he's been that it constitutes a crisis. He's committed to a psychiatric facility, and in the facility, something is revealed. Ned's relentless niceness, the quality that defines him so completely that it reads as his essential nature, is not natural. It is the product of childhood behavioral modification conducted by a psychiatrist who treated Ned for what appears to have been genuine childhood behavioral difficulty. His parents, committed to a philosophy of non-interference, had not disciplined him in any traditional sense. Ned was uncontrollable. Ned was, as a small child, genuinely difficult in ways that interfered with his ability to function in social contexts. The psychiatrist treated this with an intensive regimen of behavioral conditioning that, in the doctor's own words, spent years beating the natural aggression out of him. The kindness isn't a virtue. The kindness is a cage. Everything about Ned Flanders reads differently once you have this information. His patience with Homer is not saintly. It is compelled. His brain was conditioned to suppress anger at the cost of every other response. He cannot express rage regardless of the justification for it, because the conditioning doesn't distinguish between justified and unjustified. It just says, the anger is not allowed. And so the anger is not expressed, it is stored. It accumulates in the internal spaces that the conditioning has sealed off from expression, building pressure with no release valve. His faith is not spiritual conviction in the way we typically understand it. His faith is a framework that his conditioned mind requires in order to make sense of a world that, if he engaged with it directly without the mediating structure of religious belief, would confront him with questions he has no cognitive tools to address. Why do good things happen to Homer? Why do bad things happen to Ned? A faith that includes a divine plan makes these questions answerable. A world without that framework makes them unbearable. Ned doesn't choose faith. He needs it, the way his conditioning needs an external structure to give it meaning. His forgiveness of Homer for Maude's death is not grace. It is the programmed response of a person who was conditioned as a child to never, under any circumstances, access the anger that lives inside him. The conditioning is so complete that when the most legitimately enraging event of his life occurs, when Homer's selfish reflex kills his wife, Ned's behavioral architecture doesn't have the circuitry to process. It, as the outrage it is, it converts the experience into something the system can handle. Loss, absorbed, pain, metabolized. The man responsible, forgiven. The breakdown, when it finally comes, is not a malfunction. It's the system hitting a load it wasn't designed to carry and briefly failing under the weight. The show played this as comedy. The breakdown is funny in context. Ned screaming at the people of Springfield, normally so patient, so measured, so relentlessly gentle, is funny because of the contrast with his usual mode. But underneath the comedy is something that doesn't feel like a joke at all. There's a detail the show mentions and then mostly abandons. In the show's internal logic, and this is something the show has established through multiple episodes, not just implied God exists, not metaphorically, not as a concept. As a presence that has direct, face-to-face conversations with characters, God appeared to Homer in Homer the Heretic. God had a conversation with Homer about life and death and timing that we discussed at length in the context of the coma theory. God has engaged with Springfield multiple times. God is a real figure within the show's cosmology. God has never spoken to Ned Flanders. Ned, who has dedicated his life to his faith, who attends church faithfully, reads scripture, prays regularly, structures his entire existence around his relationship with the divine. Ned, for whom the absence of God's direct communication is a genuine theological puzzle, given that the show has established God as someone who does in fact communicate directly with people. The drunk who falls asleep during the service gets a conversation with God. The man who lives his entire life in service to God gets silence. This is not a random cruelty. The show has made a deliberate choice about which character God talks to, and the choice, when you examine it, is a statement about what Springfield rewards, about what kinds of lives receive divine attention within the show's universe, about the relationship between virtue and outcome in a world organized by the rules we've been tracing all night. The system that runs Springfield does not care about moral behavior. It cares about compliance. Burns's system rewards people who are manageable, predictable, easy to overlook. Homer is useful to the system because he's impaired and dependent and grateful for any security offered him. Ned is useful to the system because his conditioning has made him incapable of challenging authority in any meaningful way, regardless of what authority does to him. Both men are compliant, for entirely different reasons, and both of them are kept exactly where the system needs them. Homer at the plant, Ned at the church, both of them in place, neither going anywhere. And God, in the show's theology, appears to operate within the same set of priorities as everything else in Springfield. The drunk who stumbles through life and somehow keeps landing on his feet receives divine engagement. The devout man who has done everything right receives nothing. That's not an accident in the storytelling. That's the thesis. Ned Flanders is what happens when you do everything right in a system that doesn't reward rightness. He is the counterpoint to every optimistic reading of Springfield. He is the evidence that genuine virtue does not produce better outcomes in this particular universe. He suffers more than Homer. He loses more than Homer. He has less divine favor than Homer, less institutional protection than Homer, less of the seemingly random good fortune that keeps landing on Homer despite Homer's complete failure to earn it. And Ned keeps going. He goes back to church. He rebuilds his house. He tries to be a good father to his boys. He maintains the conditioning, holds the anger down, turns the other cheek again and again, because the programming that was installed in him as a child leaves him no other option. He is a man performing goodness that was never entirely his own, for an audience that takes it for granted, in a town that neither requires it nor particularly notices it. Homer Simpson is what happens when you do everything wrong in a system that absorbs wrongness without consequence. They have lived next door to each other for 36 years. The gap between their virtue and their outcomes has never narrowed. The system that keeps them both in place was never designed to close that gap. It was designed to maintain it, to keep the man who tries exactly as stuck as the man who doesn't, because the system requires both of them where they are and has no incentive to move either. The system needs a Homer. It also needs a Ned. The question is only which role you were assigned before you had any say in the assignment. Homer's was assigned in part by his mother's radicalism, and Burns's vindictiveness, and the radiation in the water, and the crayon in his brain. Ned's was assigned by a childhood psychiatrist who removed his agency through behavioral modification before he was old enough to refuse the procedure. Neither of them chose this. Neither of them can fully see it, and neither of them will ever change it, because the system that produced them is the same system that maintains them, and the system has been running long enough that it has become the town itself. That's Springfield. The full picture of it, the one that's been hiding in plain sight across 36 seasons and nearly 800 episodes. A contamination zone run by an immortal billionaire, populated by people whose capacity for resistance has been systematically damaged, maintained by a community that votes regularly and unanimously to preserve its own fictions, reset after every catastrophe by mechanisms that combine collective denial with neurological impairment, and held in permanent suspension by the dreaming mind of a man who went to sleep in April of 1993 and is still, somewhere in Springfield General, lying in a hospital bed while the world of his deepest love plays out behind his eyes. Homer at the plant, Ned at the church, Marge in the kitchen, Lisa in her room with the saxophone, Bart on the skateboard, Maggie in the corner watching everything, saying nothing, waiting, and Molman, somewhere in the background, walking into traffic again. Springfield doesn't change because Springfield cannot change. Every mechanism in it is oriented toward stasis, toward the maintenance of the current configuration, toward keeping everyone exactly where Burns's system and Homer's dream and the town's collective denial and the radiation in the water need them to be. And we watch. We've been watching for 36 years. We tune in every Sunday and we settle into the familiar world and we let it wash over us, warm and strange and not quite right in ways we've learned to enjoy rather than examine. Maybe that makes us Springfield too. Maybe we've been drinking the water all along. There's something almost beautiful about that. In the same way that Homer's coma dream is beautiful in its tragic simplicity, we built a Springfield of our own, out of nostalgia and comfort and the specific pleasure of a world that doesn't change even when everything else does. We pressed pause. We've been pressing pause for 36 years. And the family is still there, still warm, still intact, still on the couch, which is all any of us ever really wanted. When the lights are low and the night is quiet and the day behind us has been too long and the world outside has been too much and we just need somewhere to go that feels like it will always be there. Springfield is always there, even if it shouldn't be. Even if the fish has 3 eyes and the billionaire glows and the safety inspector has a crayon in his brain and the baby knows more than she's saying. Springfield is always there, and it's always the same, and every secret we found tonight has been hiding in plain sight the whole time, just waiting for someone to look a little longer than the jokes needed them to. You found them, or they found you. Here in the quiet, in the dark, at whatever hour this is, the night is long and gentle. Springfield will be here when you wake up. It always is. That's the whole point. End of section 12. End of script. Total script production notes for 11 labs. Pacing. Keep narration measured and even throughout. The tone should feel like a patient, knowledgeable friend settling into a story they love. No urgency, slight warmth in the voice. Section transitions. A soft breath or natural pause of 2 to 3 seconds before beginning each new section heading. Emphasis pattern. Avoid heavy stress emphasis. Let the weight of words come from placement and meaning rather than volume or pitch. Rhythm. Longer sentences should roll naturally without breaking for false emphasis. The script is written for breath. Natural delivery, don't insert pauses where there are no punctuation marks. The viewer prompt after section 1, commenting location, time, and subscribing, should be read warmly and conversationally, as if genuinely curious rather than promotional. End of script. The final paragraphs of section 12 should gradually soften in pace, arriving at "that's the whole point" with minimal inflection, like a door closing gently. Expansion for section 2. Insert after a tool. Placed or at minimum preserved. Paragraph. Think about the broader ecosystem of complicity that the radiation theory implies. It's not just burns. It's not just the plant. A contamination this pervasive, operating over this many decades, would require the silence of multiple institutions. The medical establishment of Springfield, the doctors, the clinic, the hospital, would have encountered patients showing symptoms consistent with chronic low-level radiation exposure. They would have run tests. They would have seen patterns. The same overbites, the same neurological indicators, the same constellation of physical characteristics presenting across the population. Any competent physician, over decades of practice, would have noticed the pattern even if they couldn't initially identify its cause. The radiation theory requires that the medical establishment of Springfield either didn't notice, which strains credibility, or noticed and said nothing. Dr. Nick Riviera, who is perhaps the most visible physician in Springfield's regular cast, is a man whose medical practice appears to be defined by the absence of competence. His famous greeting, "Hi everybody," is the verbal signature of a man who has made an identity out of cheerful inadequacy. He is, within the show's universe, a joke, an incompetent, a cautionary tale in a white coat. But what if the incompetence is not accidental? What if the medical establishment that Springfield's residents interact with has been, through the same mechanisms by which Burns has installed Homer as safety inspector, selected for the quality of their willingness to not see what they're looking at? What if Dr. Nick is not a warning about bad medicine, but a feature of the healthcare system in a company town where the employer's preferences extend into the examination room? This would explain something the show has depicted without ever directly addressing: why Springfield's residents consistently receive inadequate medical care without any apparent effort to seek better care elsewhere. They go to Dr. Nick, they accept his conclusions. They don't seek second opinions, they don't travel to adjacent communities for healthcare. They remain within the system that Springfield provides. And the system that Springfield provides is the system that Burns's money has shaped. The containment is medical as well as physical. The contamination is maintained not just by the cracked cooling towers, but by the absence of a healthcare infrastructure capable of accurately diagnosing what the cooling towers have done. And then there is the school. Springfield Elementary, which is ostensibly the primary educational institution for Springfield's children, is an environment that the show depicts with a consistency that borders on documentary. The building is decaying, the equipment is outdated, the budget is perpetually insufficient for the scale of the educational task. The teaching staff ranges from dedicated but overwhelmed to genuinely disengaged. The administration, under the leadership of whoever is performing the role of Principal Skinner in any given episode, is reactive rather than proactive, managing crises rather than building capacity. The school that Springfield's children attend is not designed to produce critical thinkers. It is designed to produce people who can pass basic tests, absorb a minimum of information, and move on into the workforce that awaits them. A workforce whose primary employer is the man whose company has been contaminating their biology since before they were born. Consider what a well-funded, rigorous educational environment might produce in Springfield. Children who ask questions, children who learn to identify patterns, children who develop the cognitive tools to trace cause and effect across time, children who might, eventually, look at the three-eyed fish and the cracked cooling towers and the safety inspector asleep at his desk and begin connecting the dots. The school that Burns' tax dollars help maintain is not that kind of school. It never has been, and the children who come out of it are, by and large, equipped to take the jobs available in Springfield and not equipped to look too carefully at who created those jobs or what the price of having them might be. The radiation theory is not just a theory about biological contamination. It's a theory about institutional design, about how a sufficiently wealthy and sufficiently motivated actor can shape the environments, the schools, the hospitals, the regulatory bodies, the political landscape of a community so thoroughly that the community's capacity to perceive its own situation is determined not by its members' natural intelligence, but by the intelligence that the system has allowed to develop. Springfield is not dumb by nature. Springfield has been made manageable by design, and the design has been running long enough that it looks natural. That's perhaps the most disturbing thing the radiation theory implies. Not that the contamination happened, not that Burns knew and chose to let it continue, but that the entire ecology of Springfield, its institutions, its culture, its norms, its collective habits of mind has been shaped by decades of a single man's investment in maintaining a population that cannot effectively challenge him. The fish have 3 eyes because the radiation is in the water. The people have 4 fingers because the radiation is in the air. And the soil and the food supply, and the bodies of the parents who pass their altered genetics to children who have never known anything other than the biology, the plant, created for them. And the institutions are inadequate because inadequacy serves the plant's owner better than competence would, and the plant's owner has the resources to ensure that the institutions reflect his preferences rather than the community's needs. Springfield is not a natural disaster. It is a managed one. Expansion for Section 3. Insert after every celebrity who shows up. Paragraph. There's another dimension of the coma theory that tends to get overlooked in discussions of it. What it implies about Marge. In Homer's dream, Marge is patient. Marge is steady. Marge is the gravitational center around which the family's chaos orbits without flying apart. She absorbs Homer's disasters, she manages the household, she loves him with a constancy that the show has tested through dozens of storylines without ever quite breaking. Marge in the dream is, in many ways, the idealized version of the partner Homer needs her to be. The question the coma theory raises, and then quietly sets down without answering, is whether this Marge is the real Marge. In the real world, in the world outside the hospital room, Marge has been sitting beside Homer's bed for weeks, for months. For what the theory asks us to accept as years, she has been doing whatever people do when someone they love is in a coma. Waiting, hoping, building a life around the vigil, finding ways to maintain the household and raise the children, and keep the structure standing while the person at the center of it lies unconscious. What does Marge look like in that world? What has time done to her? What has the experience of sitting beside an unconscious husband, of raising 3 children without their father, of managing every dimension of their lives while Homer dreams produced in her? Is she the same Marge that Homer dreams? Is she patient in the same way? Is she still waiting? The coma theory doesn't answer these questions because Homer's dreaming mind can't access them. He doesn't know what the real Marge has experienced. He knows only what he projected onto her before the coma, the qualities he loved and feared and needed, and those projections are the Marge in the dream. Patient, constant, there. But the theory's most affecting implication is also its most tragic one. Homer's dreaming mind has spent decades protecting the image of Marge as the woman who stays, as the woman whose love is unconditional and permanent and not contingent on Homer's consciousness, as the woman who is always, without question, still there. The dream Marge cannot leave because Homer cannot bear to imagine it. His unconscious mind has sealed off the possibility so thoroughly that the thought doesn't arise. The dream keeps her present because her presence is the one thing the dream absolutely requires. In the real world, sitting beside the hospital bed, Marge is a real woman with real limits and real life continuing around her. The dream Homer loves so absolutely is a dream. The real Marge is someone the dream can't reach. This doesn't make the love less real. In a strange way, it makes it more real, because Homer's love for Marge is powerful enough to sustain a decades-long simulation of her presence inside his unconscious mind. The dream is the measurement of the love. The longer the dream runs, the more episodes it generates, the more ways it finds to keep the family together, the more precisely we can measure what Homer would lose if he woke up and she wasn't there. That's not a theory about a television show. That's a theory about what it means to love someone in a way that your unconscious mind encodes as essential to survival. The coma dream is not a story, it's a need. And it keeps running episode after episode, season after season, because the need that generates it has never been resolved. The show understood this, at some level that may be entirely unconscious on the writer's part. The show keeps returning Homer to Marge. The love is tested, repeatedly, through storylines that put pressure on the marriage from different angles. And the marriage holds, every time. The resolution is always the same. Homer and Marge are together, Homer comes home, the family is intact. The dream delivers the one ending Homer's unconscious mind requires. It's not a happy ending in the conventional sense. It's the only ending the dream knows how to write, because it's the only ending Homer needs. Expansion for Section 5. Insert after, keep the reactor running, paragraph. There is a line of thinking about Burns that the show has never quite followed to its conclusion, but which is implied by the totality of what the show has established over 36 seasons. Burns is not just powerful. Burns is the oldest institutional actor in Springfield's history. He has been there longer than any building, any government structure, any family lineage in the town. His presence predates the living memory of every resident. He was there before the people who currently live in Springfield were born. He will, if his medical protocol holds, still be there after they die. What this means in practical terms is that Burns is the only entity in Springfield with genuine institutional memory. He is the only person who knows, from direct experience, what Springfield was before the plant, before the contamination, before the economic dependency that now makes the town unable to function without him. He remembers a Springfield that no one else can access through memory, whatever it was before it became his. Does he feel anything about that? The show has, across its history, suggested that Burns is not entirely without sentiment. He has moments, genuine ones, not played for comedy, where something that resembles feeling surfaces briefly before being submerged again. His relationship with Smithers contains genuine affection underneath the power dynamic. His memory of his childhood friend from long ago episodes carries a quality that suggests real loss. He has, in some episodes, shown something approaching self-awareness about the person he has become versus the person he might have been. Whether this self-awareness produces anything like conscience is a separate question. The show's answer appears to be no, or at most only in extreme situations that don't persist long enough to change anything. Burns is who he is, and the institutional inertia of a century of being that person is more than strong enough to absorb the occasional moment of reflection without producing any change in behavior. But the question underneath the question is this: what would a man like Burns know? After a century of running a nuclear facility and observing its effects on a population, about what he has done to Springfield. What does he understand that he has never been asked to explain? What does he see when he looks at the town from the height of his wealth and his longevity? The three-eyed fish. He knows what produced it. He knows because he understands from his own body what radiation does to biological systems. He knows the fish is the plant's creation. He knows what the fish implies about the water. He knows what the water implies about the people who drink it. He has the knowledge. He has had it for decades, and he has done nothing with it except manage its suppression. This is not negligence. Negligence implies insufficient attention. Burns has given the contamination and its effects more than sufficient attention. He has studied it in the implicit laboratory of Springfield's population with the resources to understand what he's looking at. He knows. He has always known, and the knowing has never produced anything except more strategic use of the knowledge. The radiation isn't an accident Burns is trying to manage. It's a resource he's been leveraging. The impairment of Springfield's population is not a side effect he's working to mitigate. It's a structural advantage he has cultivated with the same care he applies to every other aspect of the system he's built. That's the weight of it. Not that a man made a mistake and didn't correct it. That a man understood precisely what he was doing to the people around him and chose to keep doing it because the doing of it kept him exactly where he wanted to be. 140 years old. Still there. Still running it. In Springfield, the man with the most power is also the man with the most time. And he has used every year of that time to ensure that nobody else gets enough of either to challenge him. Expansion for Section 6, insert after, she just hasn't decided what to do about it yet, paragraph. Let's spend a moment with the specific quality of Maggie's watching, because it matters to understand not just that she watches, but what she watches and what she might be doing with what she sees. Maggie observes her father more closely than any other member of the family. She has been in Homer's presence for 36 years, present in the room during his disasters and his recoveries, during the conversations that reveal more about him than he knows he's revealing, during the quiet moments and the crisis moments and every variation between. She has a longitudinal portrait of Homer Simpson that no one else in the family can match, because she has been present with a consistent attentiveness that the other children, caught up in their own lives and concerns, have never quite maintained. What does Maggie know about Homer that Homer doesn't know about himself? The show has, in small moments distributed across dozens of episodes, suggested that Maggie sees Homer clearly. That behind the blank baby expression and the pacifier, she is processing her father with a depth of understanding that Homer's cognitive impairment prevents him from accessing about himself. She has been there for the moments when Homer's damage is most visible, when the impairment shows through, when the wound of his mother's absence surfaces in his behavior, when the gap between the person he might have been and the person he is becomes briefly, painfully perceptible. She can see all of this. She holds all of this. And she says nothing, because saying something would end the observation. It would turn her into a subject rather than an observer. It would require the family to engage with her intelligence in a way that she has, with complete deliberateness, avoided for 36 years. The silence protects the access. As long as Maggie is perceived as simply a baby, she can be in any room, present for any conversation, witness to any revelation, without anyone modifying their behavior for her benefit. As long as she appears to be a passive recipient of the world around her, the world around her presents itself without editing. An intelligence operating under that kind of cover, with that kind of access over that span of time, would accumulate something remarkable, a complete picture of the family, of the town, of the systems that run the town and the people who run the systems. A picture that no one else has, because no one else has been in all the rooms for all the years with all the attentiveness that Maggie has maintained. What she does with that picture, what she's building toward, what the accumulated evidence of 36 years of quiet watching amounts to, is the show's final, unanswered question. And it will remain unanswered for as long as Maggie remains in character. Which is to say, for as long as Maggie decides it should remain unanswered. The most important secrets in Springfield are the ones nobody is looking for. Because the things you don't look for are the things you don't protect against. And the thing nobody has been looking for 36 years, is the silent baby in the corner. She's still there, she's still watching, and she knows exactly how long she's been watching. Expansion for Section 8, insert after, the real Seymour Skinner was Springfield's canary in the coal mine, paragraph. The Tamzarian episode does something else that tends to get overlooked in discussions of its failures and its significance. It establishes with unusual clarity the emotional mechanics of Springfield's collective decision-making. When the town gathers to decide what to do about the imposter, the deliberation is not lengthy. There is no extended debate. There is no examination of the ethical dimensions of the choice. The meeting doesn't take long because the decision isn't actually difficult for Springfield's residents. They know immediately what they want. They want things to go back to the way they were. They want the Skinner they know, the Skinner they have history with, the Skinner whose quirks and patterns and relationship with Bart they have learned to navigate. The real Skinner is a stranger. The imposter is their neighbor, and the stranger is right. The neighbor is wrong. But correctness in this situation is not the relevant variable. This is a profoundly honest observation about how communities actually work. The truth has a disadvantage that familiarity doesn't have. The truth can be inconvenient without having any compensating warmth. The imposter is wrong, but he's warmly wrong, comfortably wrong. Wrong in ways that don't require anyone to change anything they've built their understanding of the world around. The real Skinner is right, but cold. He arrives with proof and a claim, and the kind of clean, abstract justice that disrupts the comfortable narrative without offering anything in its place except the satisfaction of accuracy. Springfield chose warmth over accuracy, and then it formalized the choice with legal authority and enforced it with exile. This is not unique to Springfield. This is how real communities handle the arrival of uncomfortable truths. The truth that arrives without the warmth of shared history, without the texture of relationship, without the accumulated goodwill of being known, that truth has a much harder time finding purchase than a comfortable fiction that has been living in the community's social world long enough to become part of its identity. The people of Springfield didn't vote for Tamzarian because they thought he was right. They voted for him because he was theirs. Because his presence in the community was woven into the fabric of their lives in ways the real Skinners could never be, regardless of his legitimate claim to the identity. They voted for the relationship over the truth. And then they made the vote binding, and they made the truth criminal, and they sent the real Skinner away because keeping him would require holding two contradictory things in mind simultaneously, and holding contradictory things is uncomfortable, and Springfield has access to a much simpler option. Make the contradiction illegal. Export the uncomfortable half. Return to the narrative that was working fine before the real Skinner showed up with his war record and his claim. Judge Snyder's decree is the show's most explicit depiction of how institutional power converts preference into law. The community's preference was for Tamzarian. That preference was formalized through the court. The formalization gave it the force of legal reality. Tamzarian became Skinner not because he earned the name, but because a sufficient institutional authority declared the declaration valid. This is how it works everywhere, not just in Springfield. Truth becomes official not when it is true, but when the institutions that have the power to declare truth choose to declare it. And the institutions that have that power are the same institutions that were shaped by the preferences of the people who built them. People who, in Springfield, have been shaped by the contamination and the cognitive impairment and the economic dependency and all the other forces we've been tracing tonight. The system declares truth. The system was built by Burns. Burns's system declares the truth that serves Burns. The real Skinner is still on a train somewhere, carrying the truth in his pocket, exiled from the community that chose comfortable fiction over his legitimate claim. He's the cleanest symbol in the show's 36-year run. The last person who showed up to Springfield with the truth and refused to let it go. They tied him to a train for that. In Springfield, that's what the truth gets you. Expansion for Section 11. Insert, after Lisa returns to being 8 years old. Paragraph. There's a specific grief in those flash-forward episodes that the show has always handled with unusual tenderness. When the audience is allowed to see an older Lisa, or a grown Bart, or even just the house on Evergreen Terrace with the children gone and the parents older, something registers that the regular episodes can't produce. A kind of preemptive mourning for people we're not supposed to be mourning yet. People who are still, in the show's permanent present, young. The flash-forwards work as emotional events precisely because they break the floating timeline's contract. They allow time to happen. They let consequence accumulate. They show you what Springfield would look like if the clock were allowed to run, and what they show you is not tragic, exactly, but unmistakably bittersweet. The children grow up and become interesting and complicated adults who carry their childhoods with them in recognizable ways. The parents are older and changed by time. The house is quieter. Springfield is still there in the background, still improbable, still running, but the family has moved through it in the way that families are supposed to move through places arriving, dwelling, and eventually leaving. And then the timeline snaps back. The flash forward closes. The future is locked away again, and the show returns to its permanent 1989. Adjacent present, and what you feel. Returning to the regular episode from the flash forward is the specific loss of having been shown a future that was then taken away. This is the floating timeline's most sophisticated effect, not the comedy of permanent childhood, the grief of permanent childhood's permanence. The awareness sitting behind every normal episode after you've seen one of the flash forwards that the children not aging is not a gift, it's a cost. The cost of keeping them is never getting to see who they become. Homer's coma dream cannot show him who they become because he doesn't know who they become. His dreaming mind doesn't have the data. It can only loop the version of them it remembers. And so, the loop runs. And the children stay the ages they were. And Homer's dream keeps him close to them in the only way available to him, by keeping them exactly as they were on the last day he was awake to see them. That's the floating timeline's core tragedy. The characters are not preserved by magic or by narrative convention or by cartoon logic or even by radiation-induced cellular mutation. They are preserved by a father's love. A love so absolute that his unconscious mind would spend decades generating a world in which the people he loves most never leave childhood, never leave the house, never leave him. Bart is always 10 because Homer needs Bart to always be 10. Lisa is always 8 because Homer cannot imagine the version of Lisa that grows up without him. Maggie never speaks because the Maggie Homer knows doesn't speak yet, and his dreaming mind can only work with what it has. The floating timeline is the shape of Homer's grief made into television, the shape of what it costs to be separated from the people you love without knowing if they're still there. Every episode is a visit. Every reset is the dream catching its breath. Every impossible survival is Homer's unconscious mind refusing to let the people he loves disappear, because the moment they disappear, the dream ends. And he's not ready to wake up. He may never be ready to wake up. And so Springfield continues. 36 years and counting. The children young, the parents unchanged, the house warm, the lights on, every Sunday night at 8. Expansion for Section 12. End of script closing material. We've spent a long time in Springfield tonight. Longer than most visits. Long enough to see past the jokes and the callbacks and the warm, familiar rhythms of a show that has been part of the cultural furniture for over 3 decades. Long enough to find what's underneath. And what's underneath, once you look, is a portrait of something that is harder to name than contamination or corporate corruption or the specific damage that one man's greed can do to a community over the span of a century. What's underneath is the story of what happens to people when the systems around them are designed to keep them small, and how those people survive anyway. Homer is diminished. He is cognitively impaired by the radiation and the crayon, and the decades of exposure to an environment designed to limit him. He is emotionally damaged by the loss of his mother and the lie his father told, and the slow revelation that the man who signs his paychecks is the man who took her. He is kept in place by a contractual obligation he didn't choose and barely understands. He is, by any reasonable analysis, a victim of forces far more powerful than anything he could have resisted, even at his cognitive best. And yet, Homer loves his family with a ferocity that the show has never once treated as complicated. He loves Marge in a way that the show has spent 36 seasons testing and 36 seasons confirming. He loves Bart and Lisa and Maggie in a way that his limited emotional vocabulary cannot adequately express, but which is never in doubt. His love is enormous, and it is real, and it lives in a body and a mind that have been systematically diminished by everything around them, and it survives all of it. The impairment doesn't touch the love. The contamination doesn't reach it. The system that broke Homer Simpson in every other way could not break the thing that matters most. That's the other story of Springfield. Underneath the conspiracy, underneath the contamination, underneath the decades of managed diminishment and institutional corruption and collective denial. The story of how people love each other in impossible circumstances. How families hold together under pressures they can't name and can't remove. How the ordinary human warmth of a house with lights on and dinner on the table and people who know your name and want you home, how that warmth survives even in a contamination zone, even in a company town, Even in the longest-running coma dream in television history, Springfield is broken. Springfield has always been broken. And the family at its center, damaged and limited and impaired and wrong about so many things, keeps showing up for each other in a way that the show has never let become entirely ironic. The love is real. In a show this strange and this dark, the love is still real. That's worth something. That's worth a lot. Marge's patience is real. Bart's loyalty, the one that lives under the mischief and the pranks and the decade of arrested development, is real. Lisa's intelligence and her longing to use it well is real. Maggie's extraordinary secret self, watching and planning and waiting for a moment that hasn't come yet, is real. And Homer's love for all of them, stumbling and incoherent and expressed through poorly timed gestures and ridiculous schemes, and the absolute inability to understand why Marge is upset this time, that love is real. It's the realest thing in a town where very little else is. That's why we can't let them go. That's the answer to the question we started with and the question we end with every time the show comes up. Why, after 36 years, do we keep watching? Why, after everything wrong we've found, does Springfield still feel like a place worth going? Because the love is still there. Even in the contamination, even in the coma, even in the dream, even in the company town where the billionaire has been alive for a century and the safety inspector has a crayon in his brain and the baby knows everything and nobody is saying, the love is still there. That's the final secret, the one that was hiding in plain sight the whole time. Right in the middle of every episode, right at the center of the family that never changes and the house that never empties and the show that never ends. It was always about the love. Everything else, the radiation, the coma, the shooting, the immortality, the conspiracy, the predictions, the floating timeline, the town with no address, everything else is the context. The love is the content. 36 seasons, nearly 800 episodes, and the secret is the simplest one. The family loves each other, and that's enough to make a light in the window. And the light in the window is enough to make it home. Springfield is waiting. It's always waiting. Get some rest. The lights are on. Absolute end of script. Additional expansion. Section 1, the nature of Springfield, insert after, it was designed to be experienced, paragraph. There's a reason the show was able to sustain its central premise for so long without the audience losing patience with it. The trick of Springfield, the thing that made the mirror work, was that it never asked you to accept it wholesale. It introduced its absurdities gradually, one per episode, wrapped in just enough familiar domestic texture that each individual impossibility seemed like a small step from the one that preceded it. By the time you were watching a nuclear plant run by a man who has been alive for a century employ a safety inspector with a crayon in his brain while the town voted to make truth illegal, you had arrived at that point through so many incremental steps that the distance from your starting point was invisible. This is, incidentally, exactly how institutional corruption works in the real world. Not through dramatic single moments of obvious wrongdoing, but through the accumulation of small acceptances. Each small acceptance normalizes the next slightly larger one. After enough acceptances, the current state feels natural, feels like what it has always been, rather than what it became through a long sequence of choices. Springfield as a satirical object was always about this. The show was never arguing that American society was obviously and visibly monstrous. It was arguing that American society got to where it was, through the accumulation of small acceptances, each one locally defensible, collectively producing something that would be unrecognizable to the person who agreed to the first one. The nuclear plant with 342 violations didn't arrive that way from day one. The violations accumulated, each one small enough to not trigger a response. Each one adding to the total in a way that no single addition made visible. By the time the total reached 342, the plant had been there for long enough that the alternatives shutting it down, forcing compliance, holding the owner accountable had costs that exceeded the cost of continuing to accept the violations. That's not a Simpsons story. That's how environmental regulatory failures work in reality. The show just made the numbers bigger and the billionaire more explicitly cartoonish and put the whole thing in a fictional town where the jokes could land without accusing anyone specific of anything specific. But the mechanism was always real. It has always been real. And the audience understood this, somewhere below the level of explicit analysis, which is why the jokes landed. The recognition was already there. Springfield didn't create the critique. Springfield named what the audience already knew. That naming is what great satire does. It doesn't invent the absurdity. It gives it a shape precise enough that it can be seen and held and examined. Springfield gave American institutional dysfunction a shape, and the shape was so accurate and so consistent that it has been getting more rather than less relevant with every passing year. The show is 36 years old, and the plant is still running, and the billionaire is still alive, and the safety inspector is still asleep at his workstation, and the town still forgets every catastrophe by the following week. Some things in Springfield change very slowly. Additional expansion. Section 4, the Burns shooting. Insert after. The official answer is Maggie Simpson. Paragraph. There's one more thread in the Burns shooting that deserves attention, and it's the one that most directly connects the mystery to the larger patterns of Springfield that we've been exploring. The shooting happened at a specific moment in the show's internal history. Burns had, in the lead-up to Part 1, done something that previous villain turns had not done. He had systematically destroyed the specific material interests of every significant character in the show's regular cast. This wasn't a generalized villainy. It was targeted. He hit the school, which affected the children and the teachers and Principal Skinner. He hit the retirement home, which affected Abe and his neighbors. He hit Moe's, which affected Barney and every regular patron. He injured Santa's little helper, which hit the Simpson family specifically and personally. And then he blocked out the sun, which affected literally everyone. What Burns did in the lead-up to the shooting was provide the entire population of Springfield with a motive for the first time simultaneously. In all the years before, Burns's villainy had been directed at individuals or small groups. The town had always been able to maintain the comfortable fiction that whatever Burns was doing to someone else was not its direct concern. The retirement home was Grandpa's problem. The music program was Tito Puente's problem. The employment contract was Homer's problem. When Burns blocked the sun, he made it everyone's problem at once. He eliminated the possibility of the comfortable non-involvement that allowed the town to tolerate his behavior in smaller doses. He forced collective awareness of collective threat in a way that the show had never quite done before, and the town responded by having one person shoot him. This is, when you sit with it, stranger than it first appears. Springfield finally achieved the collective awareness of Burns's threat that the contamination and the denial had always prevented. Every person in town simultaneously had both the motive and some version of the means to act. The town meeting at which Burns was shot was the closest Springfield has ever come to an organized collective response to Burns's exploitation of the community, and the result was a single gunshot from a single person, using Burns's own weapon in an apparently accidental or spontaneous act, which was then investigated in a way that ultimately exonerated Burns from any accountability for what he'd done. The sun was unblocked. The case was closed. By the next relevant episode, life had returned to approximately normal. What should have been the moment when Springfield finally held Burns accountable became, instead, another reset, another forgetting, another instance of the town arriving at the brink of genuine reckoning and then pulling back to the familiar, comfortable position. The shooting that should have changed everything changed nothing. Burns recovered. The power plant continued operating. The violations remained unaddressed, the contamination continued. And the political mechanism that Burns maintains in Springfield, the mechanism that ensures his preferences shape the town's governance without his name appearing on anything, continued running exactly as it had before. The greatest criminal act in Springfield's history produced the greatest example of Springfield's criminal inertia. A moment that should have been a turning point became another in the show's endless series of near misses. A catastrophe that Springfield absorbed, forgot, and moved past with the same mechanical efficiency that it has applied to every other catastrophe in its history. Who pulled the trigger matters less than this. Whatever happened in that parking lot, the system survived it. Burns survived it. And Springfield went back to work. Additional expansion. Section 7, Mona Simpson. Insert after. Homer chose to put the crayon back. Paragraph. There's a version of Homer's life that the show makes briefly and almost unbearably visible in the episode where the crayon is removed. The genius version. The Homer who can see. That Homer, freed from the mechanical limitation of the crayon's interference, moves through Springfield with a sudden, unfamiliar clarity. He notices things he never noticed. He makes connections he was never able to make. He sees the plant for what it is. He sees Burns for what Burns is. He sees the relationship between his own diminishment and the system he's been serving, and he understands it, with the clarity that his normal intelligence cannot access, with a precision that his damaged mind has never been capable of sustaining. And then, having seen all of this, he puts the crayon back. The usual reading of this moment is about comfort versus clarity. Homer choosing the comfortable fog over the painful lucidity, the familiar stupidity over the unfamiliar intelligence, the life he knows over the life he might have had. But read it against the backdrop of Mona's story and it becomes something different. Homer, in his temporary clarity, saw what Burns did. He understood, probably for the first time with real cognitive depth, the relationship between Burns's decisions and his own life's shape. The mother who was driven away, the father who made a deal with the enemy, the decades of employment at a plant run by the man who destroyed his family. The cracked cooling towers that put something in the water that contributed to the very impairment that prevented him from understanding all of this until a surgical procedure temporarily undid it. He saw it, and then he put the crayon back. This is not weakness. Or rather, it is weakness. In the same way that any human decision made under impossible conditions is weakness, it is a person doing the best they can with what they have. Homer saw the system and understood that he had no tools to fight it, not even with the crayon removed. He was one person, suddenly articulate and aware, in a town that had been shaped by decades of institutional force, far more powerful than any individual's clarity could address. He could see the trap. He couldn't escape it. And seeing the trap without being able to escape it was, for Homer, simply more painful than not seeing it. So he put the crayon back. He chose not seeing. He chose the fog. The tragedy is not that Homer made the wrong choice. The tragedy is that both choices were forms of defeat. The intelligent Homer could see his situation clearly and still couldn't change it. The impaired Homer couldn't see his situation at all and couldn't change it for that reason. The system that Burns built is robust enough to contain Homer in either state. Impaired Homer is too damaged to notice the trap. Intelligent Homer can notice it but lacks the structural capacity to dismantle it. Mona tried to dismantle it. She brought people and resources and commitment to the effort, and she managed to destroy one biological weapons facility before Burns's resources overwhelmed hers and drove her underground for 27 years. And even that partial victory didn't change anything about the fundamental structure of the system. Burns rebuilt. The plant continued. The contamination continued. The violations accumulated. The town remained captive. The message that the Mona storyline ultimately delivers is not about the failure of individual courage. Mona was courageous. She tried. The message is about scale. Individual courage, however genuine and costly, is insufficient against a system that has had a century to embed itself in every institution that matters. The contamination isn't in the water. It's in the schools, the hospitals, the courts, the police, the political structures, the economic dependencies. You can't dismantle that with an antibiotic bomb and a commitment to justice. You need something larger. Something that Springfield, with its impaired population and its collective amnesia, and its billionaire employer and its floating timeline, and its one-year-old genius who hasn't yet decided to act Springfield, hasn't developed that capacity. Maybe it never will. But Mona tried. She kissed her sleeping son goodbye and she went into the night, and she tried. For decades, for as long as she could, against a system that was always going to outlast her. That's worth remembering, even in a town that made remembering illegal. Final additional expansion. Section 2. The plant ecosystem. Let's linger in the Springfield nuclear power plant for a while longer, because the more you look at the specific details the show has given us about this facility, the stranger and more specific the picture becomes. The plant is not a generic symbol of industrial negligence. It is a highly particular fictional environment with details that accumulate across hundreds of episodes into something that resembles an actual portrait of institutional failure. The gum patching the cracks in the cooling towers. This is worth sitting with. Someone, at some point in the plant's operational history, looked at a structural crack in a nuclear facility's cooling system and made the decision that the appropriate response was chewing gum. This required a human being to perform a cost-benefit analysis and conclude that the cost of reporting the crack through proper channels was higher than the cost of sealing it with whatever was available in their pocket. The calculation that produced this outcome is not the calculation of someone who believes the facility's safety is the primary concern. It is the calculation of someone who has been given to understand, through whatever explicit or implicit communication the management has offered, that the primary concern is continued operation, and that safety concerns that would interrupt continued operation are to be managed locally and minimized wherever possible. That understanding doesn't come from a single conversation. It comes from a culture, a workplace culture that has been established over time by the priorities of the people who run the place and the consequences they have historically imposed for various kinds of behavior. You do not patch a nuclear cooling tower crack with chewing gum unless you work in an environment where you have learned that finding problems creates more problems for you than not finding them, where the messenger gets shot and the problem gets minimized, and the proper channels lead to outcomes that are worse for the person who reported than for the person who ignored. Burns has built that culture. He built it by hiring Homer and by making Homer's job security a function of his grandfather's silence rather than his own competence, which establishes clearly what competence is worth in this facility. He built it by refusing to spend $56 million to fix 342 violations that he knew about because they were documented in the inspection report. He built it by responding to the three-eyed fish story by eating the fish on television rather than investigating the water, which established clearly that the institutional response to evidence of contamination is public relations management rather than remediation. Every employee at that plant knows, without being told in any single conversation, that their job is to keep the plant running and to not generate reports that would interrupt that running. The culture of the facility is the cumulative result of years of those implicit communications. And the culture produces people who patch cracks with gum and take plutonium home as a paperweight and sleep at their monitoring stations and throw baked goods into reactor cores, because the culture has made clear that these behaviors are not meaningfully more dangerous to their employment security than actually doing their jobs would be. This is how institutional safety failures actually happen in the real world. Not through single dramatic moments of obvious negligence, but through the accumulation of a culture that systematically devalues safety reporting relative to operational continuity. Every major industrial disaster in history has this quality when you examine it closely enough. The event that looked like a sudden catastrophic failure turns out, on examination, to have been the endpoint of a long sequence of smaller failures that were each locally ignored because the local culture had developed a tolerance for them. The Simpsons, with its 342 violations and its gum patch towers and its sleeping safety inspector, is a remarkably faithful portrait of how this happens. It's just funnier. The luminous rats deserve a separate note. Radioactively contaminated rodents living inside the walls of a nuclear power plant, glowing, mutated, existing in the facility's hidden spaces, are both a joke and a genuine regulatory nightmare. The fact that the rats glow implies contamination severe enough to have altered them at the cellular level in visible and sustained ways. The fact that they are living inside the walls of the facility implies that the contamination is distributed throughout the building's structure, not localized to specific containment areas. The fact that their presence has been noted, presumably by workers who have seen them, and yet the plant continues operating, suggests that the workers have incorporated the sight of glowing rats into their baseline understanding of the workplace environment. The glowing rats are normal. They are part of the background. They exist alongside the gum patch towers and the sleeping inspector and the plutonium paperweight as elements of the ambient reality that everyone has agreed, through the culture the plant's management has built, not to escalate. A glowing rat is evidence of contamination. A rat that has been glowing for long enough that nobody reports it is evidence of culture. And culture, in this facility, is the product of Burns. The human skeletons in the basement remain the most disturbing unresolved detail in the show's 36-year inventory of horrors. The show places them there, names them, and moves on. No identification, no investigation, no explanation of how human remains ended up in the basement of an operating nuclear facility without triggering any response from any authority. The show presents this as a throwaway detail and trusts the pace of the comedy to carry the audience past the moment before they stop and think about what they just saw. Who were those people? How did they end up there? Why did the safety inspection that found 342 violations apparently not consider human remains in the basement a reportable finding? Why, In a town with a police department and a courthouse and a functioning judicial system, however impaired that system may be, by Burns's influence, did the discovery of skeletons in a working industrial facility not produce any legal or investigative response? The radiation theory's answer, if you push it, is that the skeletons may be the remains of people whose deaths were connected to the plant's violations, and whose existence in the basement represents a cover-up too old and too established to safely surface. They have been there long enough that the people who might have reported them are themselves long gone. The contamination may have contributed to deaths that were officially attributed to other causes, and the skeletons in the basement are the literal remains of the accountability that Burns's system has been burying, physically and institutionally, for as long as the plant has been running. That's speculation. The show doesn't tell us. The show put the bones there and moved on, trusting that the image would lodge in the right kind of mind and stay lodged, quietly, underneath all the jokes. It has. Final additional expansion. Section 9. Predictions and cultural weight. There's a version of the prediction conversation that's worth having that doesn't appear in most mainstream discussions of the phenomenon, and it's the one that asks what it means for a piece of art to be so culturally persistent that its observations outlast the present they were made in. The Simpsons was made in a specific moment, by specific people, observing a specific cultural landscape. That landscape has changed considerably in 36 years. Technologies have emerged and been absorbed. Political configurations have shifted. The specific anxieties and aspirations of late 20th century American middle-class life have evolved in ways that some of the show's early episodes can no longer quite reach. The show has adapted, it always adapts. It's been adapting for 3 decades, but the core of it was formed in a specific cultural moment and carries that formation. What the prediction phenomenon measures, at one level, is how long the observations made in that specific moment remain accurate, how durable the satire is, how long the patterns that the writers identified in 1990 or 1995 or 2000 continue to be patterns in the actual world. And the answer, surprisingly, is quite long. Many of the observations the show made about American institutional behavior, about the relationship between celebrity and politics, about corporate media consolidation, about the gap between official safety standards and actual industrial practice, about the way wealth insulates itself from accountability. These observations were accurate when they were made, and they have remained accurate in the interval between their making and the present. Not because the writers were prophets, but because the underlying structures they were satirizing are more durable than the specific expressions those structures take in any given decade. The plant with 342 violations is a satirical compression of something that exists at dozens of industrial facilities across the country. The billionaire who refuses to spend the money to fix the violations is not a fictional invention. The safety inspector who is selected for his inability to create problems is not a cartoon. These are real configurations, real institutional arrangements, real consequences of the relationship between wealth and regulatory authority in American capitalism. The show made them visible by making them ridiculous. And the ridiculousness didn't diminish with time because the underlying arrangements didn't change. This is what makes the show's predictions land. Not foreknowledge, not mathematical probability, the durability of the social structures the show was satirizing. When those structures produce events in the real world, when the celebrity becomes a president, or the corporation acquires the competitor, or the industrial facility's concealed violations become a public crisis, show's prediction appears accurate because the show was accurate about the structures. Events that flow from durable structures are, in a meaningful sense, predictable by anyone who understands those structures well enough. The Simpsons writing staff understood American institutional structures very well. Their educational backgrounds and their cultural attentiveness and their particular talent for finding the absurd in the actual gave them an unusually clear view of how things worked. And things that work a certain way tend to produce outcomes that fit the way they work. The show predicted those outcomes because it correctly understood the mechanisms. There's nothing mystical about that. It's just very good analysis expressed through very effective comedy. The mystery of the predictions is not a mystery. It's a tribute to how well the show understood what it was looking at. The secrets of Springfield. A final word. Every theory in this script is different. Every theory takes a different entry point, follows a different thread, and arrives at its conclusions through its own logic. The radiation theory builds from evidence. The coma theory builds from emotional structure. The shooting theory builds from the inconsistencies the show left in the official record. The immortality theory builds from what Burns's medical dependence implies about his understanding of what he's done. The Maggie theory builds from 36 years of what the show has quietly placed in the background, while everyone looked at the foreground. But every theory, when you follow it to its conclusion, arrives at the same address. The same cracked cooling towers. The same sleeping inspector. The same billionaire who glows in the dark and remembers the Spanish-American War. The same family on the same couch, in the same house, in the same impossible town that cannot be found on any map and cannot be left behind by any viewer who has loved it long enough. That's Springfield. Every secret leads back to it. Every mystery opens onto it. Every thread, no matter how far you follow it, eventually brings you home to Evergreen Terrace, where the lights are still on and the television is still running and the family is still there. They're always still there. Sleep well.